sent it. Okay.
All right, we are live. Gene, thank you very much for joining me. For anyone who is not familiar with Gene, we had a spirited discussion a few months back, and Gene, in terms of his former career, was a chief economist for the New York Stock Exchange. He was also longtime editor, economics editor at Barron's magazine, and currently hosts the Soho debates at the Soho Forum, where he pits, I guess, two strongly opinionated people on socially relevant topics and gets them to debate in front of a live audience to determine a winner and a loser. Gene, welcome back.
And on 6 of those occasions, the strongly opinionated person was myself, as you know, because the initial interview that you and I had was sparked by my debate with Richard Wolff on socialism, and you probably helped put it up there on YouTube views. It's now almost at 1 million YouTube views, my debate with Richard Wolff. And amazingly, what I also will often enclose when I announce the milestones is that Richard Wolff did a 10-minute discussion a week later about our debate. And this kind of a really funny parody of what actually took place between us. But that aside, yeah, that's what we do. And so I am a debater, and that's why I've done this Soho Forum, because I get a chance to debate. I get a chance to witness other people debating. And so I think we're going to have a little bit of a debate this afternoon, John.
Right. And I'll just say about that, for people that aren't familiar with the Soho debates, definitely worth checking out. They're all up. Most of them are up on YouTube. They're great debates.
Yeah, we had one last week that was just released yesterday, which is about the racism in the criminal justice system. Radley Balco, who maybe some have heard of, defended the resolution. There was overwhelming evidence that the criminal justice system is racist, and taking the negatives route was Raphael Manquel of the Manhattan Institute, and it was one of the liveliest debates we've had. Pretty well attended on live stream. I do recommend.
And who won?
Well, as a matter of fact, the way we're doing it with live stream is that we let live streamers vote as well. So we're holding it open for people to watch it and then vote. Although, of course, you have to vote both times initially. A number of people voted initially, and then they're going to watch it and vote again. And so tomorrow at noon, we'll announce the winner.
Right.
Tomorrow being, yeah, exactly, Tuesday.
Right. So a little bit of context for this discussion. There's two pieces of context. The first is with all the intervention that's gone on in the last 3-4 months, and of course with the type of intervention that's characterized, the fiat central banking system that's existed for the last 100+ years. Yeah. A lot of people that are trying to understand the implications of that intervention, CPI and inflation are one of the things that they look at, because of course, the debasement of the money in a given economy is something that investors and consumers alike, that it's very relevant info to them. And after the financial crisis in 2008, and again, as a result of the COVID crisis, we've seen a level of intervention, whether it be quote unquote money printing, whether it be quantitative easing, from central banks all over the world on a scale that we have not seen before. And one of the burning questions in a lot of people's minds is, when will we see this show up in inflation? And there's a number of different dynamics at work that might delay that process. But I think many of us are wondering, when, where, and how will we see this show up?
Well, I can answer that question.
Don't answer yet, Gene. Don't answer yet. I'm giving one more piece of context here. So this is a question we all want to know, and critical to that, the answer of that question is how inflation is calculated and how it's represented, and how that calculation is used by governments as a policy instrument, and how it may be used to allow them to get away with more intervention that they may otherwise would. Now, that may be a bit of a loaded thing, and I'll get you to address on that later. The second piece of context for this is that I was being interviewed by a podcast a few months ago, and I referenced inflation and the CPI calculation in an erroneous way. I made a mistake by insinuating that something was left out of it when it actually was not.
College tuition.
Right. And that was, I think I just lacked discipline there, because what I was trying to communicate was that the CPI wasn't a perfectly reliable measure of inflation. But what I did instead was I misquoted, I misrepresented the calculation. And you, in fact, emailed me and corrected my thinking on that, which I very much appreciate.
I pounced on you, John,
mercilessly. Wait, hold on, Gene. All that being said, that's why I wanted to have this discussion today, because I think so many of us in the space are looking at that, but it's a very misunderstood and poorly understood aspect of this whole economic and financial picture that we're trying to understand. You claim to be an expert on the CPI and having looked at it before. And so I wanted to have you on today. Gene, thank you very much. Go ahead.
Okay, yes. As a matter of fact, look, we probably, as we were establishing before we went on the air, John, it's probably of interest to Bitcoin users to talk about a world in which Bitcoin is money and in which we do not have government running most of our statistics. And I opined, and we can pursue that a bit later, that there would probably be an interest in price indexes even in a free market. There's obviously lots of reasons for price indexes in this market, government dominated, but we can get to why there might be interest in a free market as well. Because of course, prices are going to change under a Bitcoin regime. They're going to go south. But I want to address the primary premise of the context that you laid out. We have already been seeing the effect of the monetary intervention in prices and the reason in the price indexes. And the reason for that is that since the early 1990s, we have had forces in this in the national and global economy that would have meant probably, just to pick a number, a 5 to 10% decline in prices every couple of years, maybe a 4 to 5% every year. So we have had.
Are those forces technological advancements that are causing deflation? Is that what you mean?
A whole combination of forces, which I'll get to in a moment. But I just want to summarize the point then and say then that if you work with my assumption, let's say 5% down, and if the price indexes are showing 1.5% up, then that's a 6.5% inflation every year. So I'm just saying, in terms of the math, if you're expecting 5% down every year and you get 1.5% up, then you get plenty of price inflation. But then getting to your question about what were those forces, why do I choose the early 90s? Well, I date that from the end of the Cold War, which opened up huge cheap labor markets. The end of the Cold War, which accelerated greatly global competition. So I date that from the early 90s in that sense. In addition, there have been, for whatever reason, technological probably, a great deal of discounting. So many of the great fortunes have been made by discounting, by cutting prices. Now that was the Walmart effect prior to the early 90s, and the Walmart effect was huge. And by the way, it was missed by the CPI, which I can explain. The Walmart effect being the enormous discounting of brands that made Sam Walmart a billionaire. And then, of course, obviously, the Bezos effect, which I'll call it, the other kind of price discounting, that I guess arises from technology. And so given those forces, again, the deflation, the falling, I'm waving my arm to get the light back on. There we go. The global forces, the technological forces, hugely price deflationary. I hate to use the word deflation without using the word price, because deflation really has another meaning, price deflationary. So we've seen plenty of inflation.
Well, let's make that distinction at the outset, or I'll ask you if it's a necessary distinction to make. Should we be making a distinction between monetary inflation and price inflation? Is that important for this argument?
Yes.
Can you explain the difference and why it's important?
Yeah, well, I think it's important to any Austrian, anybody who wants to think about Bitcoin, anybody in your audience. And of course, I just want to, of course, when I talk about the 6.5% inflation, I guess to clarify, obviously, all of that monetary expansion that was that you correctly said was hugely, so it was so huge, it was unprecedented. We had monetary expansion since World War II that was pretty big at times, but this was unprecedented. As you say, but that lifted a 5% down to 1.5% up. But then now to your other question about deflation versus price deflation. Of course, what used to be the case was 100 years ago, the dictionaries defined deflation and inflation as an increase in the supply of money or a decrease. And so I think that's useful to hold on to. That when money contracts, which does happen under a central bank regime or government-dominated regime, money can contract, and so that's something to deal with, and we should have that concept in place. That's deflation. And then inflation is that money increasing. Some might want to put a fine point on it and talk about inflation, money increasing faster than goods. But we just want to hold on to the money supply deflating or inflating. And so that's why whenever I wrote about price inflation in my column, or whenever I talk about it, I'm willing to use the words inflation and deflation, but always with that extra modifier price inflation, price deflation. And obviously in a Bitcoin regime, we would have essentially a flat money supply, neither deflation nor inflation. So all of that is worth clarifying. In a regime of gold, we'd have mild inflation, a mildly, slowly increasing money supply under a regime of gold. But as I say, under the regime of the Federal Reserve and the central banks, we do have at times deflation, outright deflation, contraction in the money supply.
And is it fair to say that you mentioned Bitcoin being a flat, ultimately when it's fully issued, it would be a flat money supply. Is it fair to say that that would cause price deflation because there's no inflation in the money supply itself, and vice versa? If there's inflation in the money supply, you'll see price inflation in goods and services. Right. You should.
Well, yes, although of course the first part of what you said about obviously Bitcoin being flat in terms of supply, but goods and services expanding, then of course you're going to get a decline in prices. And also to put it's important to stress a decline in one of the most important prices of all to most of us, a decline in wages and salaries in nominal terms. Also. So not just what the prices that business charges, but the prices that it pays for its labor will decline over time. But then with respect to the other side of it, when you talked about an inflationary money supply, there I guess you have to introduce the idea that it's approximately a race between the money supply and goods and services. If the money supply is expanding 1% to 2%, but goods and services expanding 7%, then you will still get price deflation, of course. So it's a matter of simple math in terms of the concept. Of course, empirically, it works out in a more complicated fashion. Yeah.
Right. I can already tell we're going to be hopping around a lot here, Gene, but I would expect no less between you and I. So let me ask you this question because I think it's highly relevant to what's going on now and the question that arises in a lot of people's minds. You touched on it a moment ago, but I think there's probably more to uncover there. We've seen all this monetary inflation over the last 4 months, let's say, the expansion of money. Why don't we see commensurate price inflation over the same or a similar period? What are the forces that are keeping price inflation in check when monetary inflation is so robust?
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's a good question in this sense, because I've said that we basically had the baseline is negative 5% every year. And I've said the baseline of negative 5% every year, just to choose a sort of a number in principle, has been prevailing for the last 25 years. But then you fairly ask, well, yes, but we had, of course, monetary inflation in the 90s and in the early aughts and in the teens. We had monetary inflation then, but then you say, hey, look, now we're having a ratcheting up, an acceleration. So shouldn't we see some difference in conventionally measured price inflation? And we aren't. And there I would explain it by saying that that we have slack labor markets. It does appear, certainly based upon the U.S. experience that started in the early 1970s, that in order for a price inflation to start snowballing and building on itself, you need a tight labor market. So it's now obviously when you have a double-digit unemployment rate, you have the arguably a slack oversupply of labor, and that will dampen inflation because, again, the most important price of all, in a sense, really is the price of labor. And so that's how I would explain that. Although then, of course, somebody might ask me, well, what happens if we do get back to a fairly tight labor market? What will happen then? That's interesting to explore as well. But I would say the slack labor market is the explanation. Yeah.
Right. And let's put a pin in that, because I think we should explore, when the labor market rebounds, the effect that this will have. But just for a moment, let's pause that, because I'd like to ask, to what degree is the global demand for dollars scooping up a lot of this excess liquidity and, basically prohibiting it from entering the market in terms of chasing more money, chasing fewer goods? So if there's deleveraging going on, if there's a lot of US dollar denominated debt, how much is the new dollars being created being drawn away via those processes, and as a result not showing up in consumer prices?
Well, that's interesting. I hadn't quite, that's a clear enough point. It's difficult to trace. Obviously, there are a lot of, dollarized economies, and the dollar is indeed king. I use the whole point about the dollar as an indication of what truly happens in a world market, that we all prefer one currency. At this point, the dollar is the default currency. But so I think that's a factor, what you just said. The other part of it is that if you look at the conventional measure of M1, there has been, it connects very closely to the soaring savings rate. People are basically, certainly I and others, we're not spending because there isn't a whole lot to spend on. And the conventionally measured personal savings rate is at a record high, to beat all records. And so that money is basically showing up as M1. And it's basically not being spent, it's inert. So that's part of the explanation as well, about what's going on. But right. So therefore I'm not too surprised that we're getting essentially nothing in the way of measured price inflation.
Right. And on that point, so those two variables that we just discussed, and possibly as a comparison to 2008, what we're saying is a lot of this new money isn't basically reaching the market. It's either being used to deleverage debt, it's being used for savings. And in 2008, the stimulus and the QE activities, these basically went into the banking system and had a similar result, as they didn't go directly into, let's say, Main Street economy. And as a result, that's probably another reason why we didn't have a tremendous amount of official inflation from that period onward. This time we have something that's materially different. This time, even though the bulk of these activities have remained, let's say, in the financial sector, we do have a form of UBI. A lot of people have received checks this time. And so that makes the insertion point kind of on Main Street. And you would think that, or what do you think is the effect of money going directly to consumers? And if this is a trend that continues, and I'd like to get your opinion on whether or not you think it will, what do you think will be the effect of getting money directly in the hands of consumers vis-a-vis inflation?
Okay, then you are asking me what will happen down the road. I mean, with respect to what you call the UBI, the Universal Basic Income, and I want to explain that to listeners. Make sure, John, that at every stage you're not losing people. Not everybody knows what that stupid UBI stands.
That's what I got you here for, Gene.
And so that's the $600 that people are getting, the unemployed people are getting in terms of extra pay, and boosting their pay in most cases to $900+ more than small business can afford. I don't think it's due to expire at the end of July. I mean, tragically and stupidly, maybe it's going to be renewed. It's difficult to imagine that it will be that it's permanent, that's here to stay. I don't think psychologically or in any other way the market is banking on that. Certainly, there's, I mean, clearly it's shafting mostly small business, but it is shafting even larger businesses that normally do employ a lot of people for less than $900 a week. It's absurd that, especially that small businesses have to compete with the government and can't pay $900 bucks a week to their employees. Otherwise, they'd go out of business. And so that's ridiculous. But I do think that there will be enough pushback, and there already has been from business, so that even if it's renewed for a bit, it's not here to stay. So I don't really agree with this the UBI argument that the UBI has arrived. We've had this ridiculous subsidy, and I think it's going to pass. If it survives another few months, it's essentially going to be gone. And so therefore, I don't really think it's going to be a factor. But hopefully to address the question that you seem to be really asking, what sort of things return to normal, which is going to be a slow process. I've been looking for a recovery, but not anything like a V-shaped recovery. We already are recovering, by the way. The recession that began, I guess, officially in February, according to the Business Cycle Dating Committee, ended probably last month. And we are beginning to expand. But of course, the big question is, at what point do we does the expansion reach so that we are back where we were in terms of output compared to the fourth quarter of 2019? And I think that will be probably not until the second quarter of next year before we climb back. So it's going to be a slow climb back. And I believe that the unemployment rate is going to remain high. And therefore, there will still be slack labor markets, and with that subsidy phasing out, I do think that wages will climb slowly, and that therefore that kind of pressure that is normally required to bring about an accelerating inflation will not be there. And then on top of that, I do think that the other price disinflationary forces that I mentioned that have brought about essentially in normal terms a decline in prices, the disinflationary forces of cheap labor abroad, the global competition, the Bezos effect, even the Walmart effect, still. I think will still be there, and therefore I don't expect too much in the way of an acceleration in measured price inflation. Although, again, I say I think it's unlikely, and I'm willing to be contradicted by events. But I think there are too many forces in place that will prevent it. Principally, to go back to the labor point, I think it's going to be a long time before we get back to an unemployment rate of 4% or less.
Right.
Yeah.
So what do you think would be a catalyst for, and maybe this is a good time to actually break into the CPI calculation, but what do you think would be a catalyst for unacceptable levels of inflation? And just to put this in a historical context, throughout history, there's various examples of central banks or governments getting into tangly situations, economically speaking, and then using the printing presses, whether they be, actual printing presses or digital, to try to get themselves out, to print their way out of trouble, to print, to monetize debt, etc. We're seeing, almost parabolic moves in central bank balance sheets and in money supply growth, etc. I'm hearing from you that you think things will trend toward returning to normal over the next 12 to 18 months, although it'll be a lagging sort of recovery. At what point do you think these methods of intervention will begin to, genuine cracks will begin to emerge, and they will stop being as effective, and I use air quotes for that, as they have been in the past, and we'll see genuine problems with either debt or currency crises, things of that nature?
Yeah. Well, my easy case in the sense that I think that I can project us forward to a period when there'll be so many forces in place that would lead to price inflation that it's almost inevitable that about 10 years from now, The disinflationary forces of cheap labor abroad will be mostly played out. It started in the early 90s. It was a slow process, but that I think that mostly it will be played out by the early 2030s, and that force will be gone. And then the real igniting factor will be the elder care entitlements that keep boosting the debt and keep putting us at a point where putting the federal government at a point where the cost of servicing the debt, just the interest rate cost on the debt, will be a huge portion of federal expenditures. Where the U.S. is leading a charmed life because the average interest rate on the debt is about 2%. Historically, it's been 6% since World War II. If as the Congressional Budget Office projects, if it simply climbs a bit above 4%, given the huge amount of debt that's piling up, it's going to be a swamping cost to the federal government. And then on top of that, the elder care entitlements are going to have to be coped with. And then that's the mandatory spending. Then there's the discretion. So what I'm saying then is that there will be huge pressure on the central bank to print our way out of this. And indeed, the odd part is I've been writing articles about this for a long time, and I get the Krugmans the Paul Krugmans and others of this world correcting me by saying, "Oh, we couldn't possibly be like Greece." I once did a cover story for Barron that we could be like Greece, and Paul Krugman wrote something saying, well, the people at Barron's are going crazy. I had to point out to Krugman and others that that analogy didn't come from me. It came from the Congressional Budget Office, the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office, that we could be like Greece in that sense. Now, Greece obviously owed debt denominated in euros and not in its own currency. And of course, it's a not to worry, they say, because our debt is denominated in our own currency. But of course, that will mean we'll put oil on the fire. That will mean that there'll be pressure on the central bank to print. And then if we will no doubt, certainly give or take in 10 years, be at a point where the labor markets will be tight. So if several props are taken out, cheap labor abroad, a reasonably tight labor market, and huge amount of money printing sparked by the need for the U.S. government to be able to pay all its expenses, those three factors will be in place to ignite price inflation. Now, I'm going 10 years out. You might say, well, why go 10 years out? How about 5 years out? Well, other things could happen too. But the point is, what I'm saying is that I'm dealing with a reasonably easy case. And as a matter of fact, Alan Greenspan agrees with me in a book he published around, it was 2008, and forget the title for the moment. He actually made that projection that by the 2030s, disinflationary forces will be played out, and there'll be huge pressure on my counterpart to print money because the elder care entitlements are exploding. So that's an easy answer. That's 10 years out. If you want to then argue it could happen sooner because there might be other factors in place, it's possible. I'm just dealing with what I regard as a fairly safe prediction.
Right. I think many, at least the people that I speak to and listeners of this show, would be surprised to hear that you think it could persist for, into the 2030s, this level of intervention, for example. Oh, well, what I'm saying is that the level of intervention, which has been sparked by this crazy Great Suppression, as I've called it, that's one thing. I'm just talking about the simple green eye-shade look at the federal budget and at the course that it's on. And obviously, we've accelerated that. The Congressional Budget Office was projecting that debt held by the public would be over 100% of GDP in about 10 years. Debt held by the public, by the way, which is the figure that I like to use, a lower figure than the other figure that's normally used. But now they're projecting. What is debt held by the public? Can you explain that to people? Well, basically, it does include debt held by the Federal Reserve, but it excludes debt held by the public. Maybe I best explain by talking about what it excludes. It essentially excludes intragovernmental debt. It excludes the so-called trust funds that government is holding. And so it's essentially almost what it sounds like. Debt held by U.S. investors, debt held by central banks around the world, debt held by foreign investors. Last I checked, it probably is corporations.
Oh, yes, sure. Corporations, any institution. And 40% of our debt was, and maybe lower now because of what's happened, but I'm not sure. 40% of our debt was held by foreigners, and about over $1 trillion of it held by Chinese investors and sovereign wealth funds, the Chinese central bank. And so that's essentially what the Congressional Budget Office likes to use, because that really is the debt that's out there. It does include central bank debt held by the Federal Reserve. But the point is that intergovernmental debt is actually going to decline over the next few years, because that's those treasuries, treasury bonds and bills that are held by the Social Security Trust Fund. They're getting cashed in now. In order for the Treasury, for the Social Security arm of the government to pay Social Security benefits, they're beginning to sell back to the Treasury the bonds that they've been holding. And so what I'm saying is that intragovernmental debt will be declining over the next few years. And that's when I try to explain to people that they're looking at a crazy number, you're going to look at a number that's declining, that intergovernmental debt. See, a lot of people like the intergovernmental debt as a measure of the unfunded liabilities. I know that's another way of calculating the US debt situation, unfunded liabilities going into the future. I think it's simpler just to explain to people that right now we have debt held by the public that's about 100% of GDP, and it continues to climb because the U.S. Treasury has to continue to incur deficits in order to pay its bills, and it's going to climb to about 150% of GDP. It's in a couple of years going to be above its post-World War II highs with no end in sight. And that essentially is the sort of a clean measure that we can cite about that. So what I'm saying is that when you talk about, when you said people are surprised that there's going to be another orgy of money creation, the orgy of money creation is going to be sparked by something that's fairly straightforward. How is the U.S. federal government going to pay its bills? How is it going to meet the elder care entitlements that keep climbing? How is it going to meet the interest payments on its debt that keeps climbing? And then on top of that, the discretionary spending. There will be a huge incentive for the central bank to print money in order to meet those, to pay those bills.
And again, for further context on this discussion, thus far this year, in response to the crisis, the U.S. government has stimulated the economy to what degree as a percent of GDP? Are you familiar with those numbers? Well, you know what I'm saying. You know, I think.
I'm sorry, stimulate. Well, I'm sorry.
Well, they've. I believe that the number is somewhere around 30%, where they've, you know, injected liquidity, printed money, however you want to characterize it.
Indeed, it's about, it's just balk at your term stimulate. I don't regard it.
Well, I do too, but it's a common language, right?
Okay.
So what I'm basically just saying, what has the percentage been, so we know the level of intervention?
Careful over the language here, John. Come on, we don't have to use. That's why I said price deflation. I'm trying to teach you good English. Okay.
But, right. Give me a better term.
Well, it's obviously it's expanded the deficit. It expanded government expenditure. That's all it's done.
As a percent of GDP, what was that?
Yeah, yes. Well, actually, it's not huge. I guess GDP is around $20 trillion, and it's up. And so the expansion of the deficit is about 3 to 4 trillion. So what? So it's about 15 to 20% of GDP. I don't know. I don't regard that as too important. I mean, what I look at is really what has it done to the debt, and how much has it boosted it by? But yeah, and if you take that 15 to 20%, that's the reason why we're ratcheting up in terms of the Congressional Budget Office to 100% of GDP for debt held by the public. So, and that was supposed to happen 10 years from now, right, given the normal trajectory. So we're now 10 years accelerated toward that day of reckoning, or the beginnings of the point where the debt begins to become difficult to manage. Other things, of course, are going to start giving. Certainly, they're going to start managing medical care for the old people. They're going to start shafting them in all kinds of subtle ways. There'll be all kinds of rationing and craziness going on. And it doesn't appear as though there's any other way to work it out other than to work it out in crisis mode. Oddly, the last great prophet of the impending fiscal crisis was Bill Clinton, who briefly started talking about it in 08 and 09, about how we have to save for the future and so on. because we've got to pay for the baby boomers when we were briefly incurring surpluses of the budget in 98 and 99. Yeah.
Right. Here's a question for you. And I think sometimes economists may get lost in their own data. And so we had someone in the news asked Jay Powell recently, we're seeing widening inequality, wealth gap in the United States over the past several years, but let's just take the previous 10 years as a period on which to look at. And Jay Powell said, yes, I think that's true, but I don't believe that, central bank intervention has really anything to do with that. Right. And I think I disagree strongly with that. I'd like to get your opinion on it. But when we're talking about these things and we're looking at the amount of debt in a historical context, we're looking at the money supply growth in a historical context, and we look at them and we say, well, that's unusual, but hey, everything is still, everything still kind of works. What is it that we will look at amongst all the different things that we can look at? And I include social variables in that, and as well as economic. What is going to be the thing that we look at and say it's broken? What's the metric or the indicator that we should look at and recognize that when that's, when that says something, it means that this is, we've passed the point of no return, or something's broken, because we can look at these charts, these parabolic charts, all day long and say, yeah, this changes the nature of this or that, and it's going to be harder to sustain and whatever timeline in the future. But what is it that tells us that something is broken?
Well, you use the term broken, and maybe I've been making a distinction between what's broken and what's a real crisis. In terms of what Powell said, the two obvious things that he's missing in terms of exacerbating inequality and the Fed's role in it, which I'll mention in a moment, although I do want to insist on saying that part of the reason why I take an interest in the CPI and in other matters involving inequality is I do believe that that income inequality in any measured sense has been much exaggerated. It has increased, but I think that most of the ways of measuring it that are standard very much exaggerate the increase. But with that said, getting to what Powell said, the two obvious things that have been going on. Number one, the low interest rates, the 0% interest rates have been shafting old people. Old people who live on what they've saved. Old people, many of whom are about at the poverty line or not much above it, but they're getting by okay because they've accumulated. Maybe they're not paying for their house. They bought their little condo down West Palm Beach, as my mother had. So they're not starving, but they're hurting. And what they do, what old people do, is the standard investment is the bank certificate of deposit with a fixed interest rate. And they obviously should be in that kind of instrument, a safe instrument without a whole lot of future, because they don't have a whole lot of future ahead of them, and they just want a steady, reliable income. And so what I was first noticing, of course, hardly difficult to see it, which was that the poverty rate was not declining the way it should have in the 01-02 expansion, partly because the returns on those bank CDs were basically not keeping people up, even with measured inflation. They were shafting those people, and now he continues to do so by clobbering the interest rates and therefore clobbering the bank CD rate. So, and that's numerically pretty massive. And then on top of that, obviously, then these old people become targets for some of the fast buck artists who give them cockamamie schemes for investing in the stock market that seems safe because they need to increase their returns. And then that only exacerbates the problem. I know that firsthand because I knew a couple of those schemers when I was down in West Palm Beach with my mother. So that's where the interest rate, the fixed income folks who are the old people, many of whom are quite limited in terms of their income, are the people he's directly shafting. And that's hardly a point that's original with me. But second, just as obviously, the the Great Suppression, the shutdown, has, despite the fact that it's nice, I guess, to have an unemployment insurance check and $600, it's not very good to lose your job, and not all those people are qualifying for the unemployment insurance. Essentially, of course, the shutdown has not hurt the knowledge workers. The 30, let's put it like 32% of us are knowledge workers. And I don't know how they get such a precise figure, but obviously the better off have managed to keep their jobs, can work from home, and survive. And so it's the top third have been okay, but Mr. Powell, you just shafted the bottom 2/3. Don't you think that hurts that exacerbates inequality? Get your head out from up your ass, Chairman Powell, is what I would say. Please understand what you do. And of course, please understand that it's not, hopefully not too subtle a point to understand what you're doing to people who buy bank CDs when you clobber the interest rate. So that should be palpably obvious to all to see. But with respect to your point about that, when that's already broken, we're broken in lots of ways. And if you want to focus on just only the ways in which I blame the central bank for the ways in which we're broken, I guess we could. I mentioned those two ways. Certainly, the only, again, thing that I latch on is that we are definitely, the one thing that we can be reasonably sure of is that we are headed for a fiscal crisis 10, 15 years down the line, and that what Mr. Powell just did is accelerated by 10 years. That's a crisis. Broken, however, lots of things are broken. And but although when I think about what's broken, I guess what comes to mind are many things that you can't specifically blame on the central bank. But certainly the central bank's eager participation in the housing bubble, and then its mismanagement of what occurred in 08-09 caused a major crisis. And so it's got that on its record. I believe, however, that we have not really had a conventionally measured housing bubble or stock market bubble. We do have a bond bubble in a strict sense, but I don't think that bond bubble is going to burst over the next few years. I think that what Powell is depending on, and he's probably going to be right, is that the U.S. economy still leads a charmed life. Our Treasury debt is still regarded as a safe haven, and he's depending on that. And so that's the reason why I don't foresee a crisis down the road. On the other hand, again, there are those who disagree with me. Immediately down the road, I mean, a crisis immediately down the road. I think that will muddle through this, but clearly we're looking at all kinds of breakage left and right in this economy just from the Great Suppression alone. We had a 3.5% unemployment rate, and then look what happened because of government's suppression of the economy.
I like that term, the Great Suppression. Is that yours? Did you come up with that?
It's mine. I was hoping to get famous from it, John.
Well, now you will, Gene. Now you will.
See, I thought, John, here, just get my ruminations. I thought Great Recession, Depression, and I said, suppression. Isn't that perfect? The article that I wrote about it, called The Anatomy of the Great Suppression, which I guess I can send you a copy of, just began with Murray Rothbard's point in his book about the Great Depression, that not all downturns are necessarily business cycle theory determined, and that there can be plague, there can be governments doing crazy things, there can be crazy work. We can have a cessation of capitalist acts between consenting adults for other reasons. And so I said, yeah, well, I think if Murray were alive today, he would agree. This is the Great Suppression. The government has simply declared that capitalist acts between consenting adults are by and large going to be suppressed. And that's the reason why we're having this soaring unemployment rate. And then I said, well, that means then that we don't have the subtle imbalances that Keynesians can't understand. Once the government starts to lift the great its suppression, we'll begin to climb out of it, which is more or less what's been happening. Although, of course, there's been a lot of carnage of so much that's occurred as well.
Yeah. A couple points on what you've just articulated. The first is, you said initially you had thought of a fiscal crisis, because I was saying, what can we look at to see things are broken? And you said, well, broken is, maybe it's a bit too ambiguous, but you said you see a potential fiscal crisis on the horizon in a 10 to 15 year period. And then you say that this has been brought forward because of the recent suppression and the intervention that happened as a result.
For the 4 trillion.
Right.
Yeah.
So is that, just to clarify, are you saying you think the fiscal crisis may be around like a 5-year sort of time period rather than a 10, 15 now?
No, actually, I guess that what I meant was that I used to say 15 to 20 years down the road, and now I'm saying 10 to 15. No, see, again,
right. Okay.
What I'm latching on really is the easy forecast. The easy forecast because I don't have to manage money. I don't. So therefore, I'm just saying that what I would. Well, although I will go stick my neck out and saying I will be surprised if we see any major crisis occurring over the next 5 years or the next 2 or 3. Obviously, a lot of people disagree with me. I do think that when you look at the realities, our debt is a safe haven. The U.S. economy is broken, but compared to what other economies? I think that we lead a charmed life and we'll muddle through. But the chickens will come home to roost because of the factors that I mentioned 10 to 15 years from now. There are too many dark clouds forming 10 to 15 years from now to be denied. And so I think that's a fairly safe prediction.
Right. And I guess my original question was, as you say, the chickens coming home to roost means fiscal crisis, potential currency crisis,
and
that kind of stuff.
Right, exactly. And then I see another return to an unstable dollar, and then I see an opportunity for Bitcoin and possibly an opportunity for gold. And that's the potential silver lining. And I think that the dollar will we could have a Dow dollar Dow dollar death spiral. The people pulling out of, foreigners, of course, pulling out of our stock market, and then the dollar declining as a result as they sell those dollars. So I think we could have currency instability 10 to 15 years from now, as part of that fiscal crisis. Of course.
So if I'm hearing you correctly, from here, you see somewhat of a similar recovery post 2008-9, kind of a continuation of the macro trend, but albeit kind of muted, not that robust.
Well, yeah, I guess that's you're right. In terms of timing, it's about the same, although actually, for what it's worth, because I like to insist on the point that no matter what numbers you look at, this is very different from 08-09. In particular, conventionally measured, a recession is a contraction in economic activity. But once you start
for 2 quarters.
Yeah, well, the 2 quarters is more or less empirically right. It was never, the folks at Business Cycle Dating Committee say, no, we don't say 2 quarters. I could tell you an inside story about how politicized they are, those folks who think they're the big philosopher kings who talk about the business cycle. But that aside,
Go for it. What? I'd love to hear it maybe at the end of the conversation.
Okay. Well, I heard this, it was secondhand, but only once removed because about what they did. But that aside, the 2 quarters tends to be empirically right. Although as a matter of fact, it may not even be 2 quarters this time. They declared that the recession started in February. They like to choose a month, but it's better to choose the first quarter. So it basically started in the first quarter, and then it actually continues to the second quarter. But the point is that is 2 quarters in terms of quarters, although it's fewer months probably. But the point is we are already beginning, the expansion has already begun. So therefore you're down in the dumps, but then you start moving up. So therefore the recession is over. It lasted a little less than 2 quarters, unlike the 08-09 recession that lasted 1.5 years, 6 quarters. And then the nature of the recovery, that is very different. It's essentially what already existed beginning to come back to life. So again, I wouldn't, but certainly if I'm right that we will, then when you get to a point where output is on a par with the previous peak, which was the fourth quarter of 2019, and if I'm right that it's going to be by the second quarter of next year, then basically peak to peak will be a shorter period than 08-09. So I'm just maybe insisting on putting a fine point on it. But the point is, it's not a V-shaped recovery. It's a slow recovery, but it was a very quick recession. We are beginning to climb out of it. unimaginable that the politicians are going to impose much of a lockdown again. They're too scared to do that. And so even though there's been, the Texas, they opened the bars, they shut the bars, that stuff, there's going to be a continued climbing out.
Well, let's extend this line of thinking and discussion for a moment and say, if you're right, and it's a much shorter recession than 08, 09, do you think, and because of the sheer magnitude of the intervention that occurred over that very short historically period, do you think we will overshoot the recovery? And do you see there's any chance of perhaps, rolling into a boom period rather than a slow kind of slogging recovery?
Well, I think I don't expect that. I mean, for what it's worth, we never, as I perhaps mentioned briefly before, the 10.5-year expansion that brought us to a low unemployment rate, although of course it was partly low because a lot of people had just quit working altogether. But the 10.5-year expansion that ended in the fourth quarter of last year, in terms of the conventional measures of two things, a housing bubble or a stock market bubble. The stock market, in terms of conventional price earnings ratios, was way below where it had been in 99 and 2000, where there really was a stock market bubble. So therefore, there was nothing observable in terms of a stock market bubble, at least compared to what we saw in 99 and 2000. By last year. And in addition, there was nothing like the housing bubble, measured in a couple of ways, house prices in relation to general prices or house prices in relation to rents. So we had a 10.5-year, so to speak, expansion. It was not a boom. I mean, it was only 2% a year. So that's why I would say that, I'm just citing immediate precedent, I would be surprised if we get to a point where we have an overheated boom. I mean, at least probably will have some recession 5 years down the pike. But I mean, it's my crystal ball, so to speak, clouds over when you talk about a real getting into any kind of boom. I don't think it's too likely, given what we had through the expansion of that ended in the fourth quarter of last year.
Right. Fair enough. All right. Let's go back to something you said before, because
can we talk about the CPI?
Well, we'll get there. We're slowly winding our way there. So, to me and many people in, let's say Bitcoiners, we see, well, obviously we see the world through the lens of Bitcoin many times, and sound money as well. But we see a lot of the inequality and the social unrest and the wealth gap occurring in the world as a manifestation of basically, the central bank policy and the control over the creation of money via a very small group of people who are able to benefit unfairly from that right or power. And so again, if we look at the period that we were just referring to, 08, 09 to fourth quarter 2019, 10, 11 years, 11, 12 years of mild expansion, mild economic growth, but also 10 years of expanding inequality by a number of metrics.
Yeah.
And, I think, again, referencing my kind of, referencing Jay Powell and how I believe his statement was disingenuous, I think this is largely a result of money printing. And so if we've seen such a high degree of money printing over a far more condensed period, let's say it was even more than what we saw over the preceding 10 years, or at least, close to it. I don't have the exact numbers in front of me. And I suspect we'll see, as a result of that, not immediately, but in not too long a period of time, commensurate the same process of inequality driven by money printing as we saw at any other period. And because we've seen so much money printing now, I suspect we'll see even accelerating inequality. And you referenced that, you think the income inequality has been exaggerated in some respects. And I'd like to get you to explain what you mean by that and what, your take on that.
Okay. Well, I have to admit that I guess when I talk about the reasons for persistent inequality and the rise of inequality, probably I go for the low-hanging fruit, which and that generally is not specifically related to the central bank, even though probably you could educate me a bit about the way in which the central bank causes inequality that I'm not specifically aware of. Obviously, it lends money to the rich. It doesn't lend money. It favors the large financial institutions. It strengthens them. It does all kinds of things that it clearly creates greater concentration of in the financial industry. It does all those things. When I talk about, but I was supposed to have a debate on inequality with a Washington Post columnist, and I wanted to mention the simplest things, which is that in the high wage, high productivity cities, increasingly because of government intervention, the cost of housing is prohibitively high. And so we need government to do less. We need government to free up the real estate markets in New York, San Francisco, places like that, so that people can move to these areas and enjoy the high wages. I speak about the rise of and that is, of course, didn't used to be the case in the 60s and 70s, but the restrictions on building certainly not nearly as severe as they were over the last 10 to 20 years. And you just drive yourself crazy looking at San Francisco and Seattle, those crazy places, Portland, New York. They supposedly are bleeding heart progressives, and they don't realize what their housing policies do to people of limited means. Well, by the way, when you mentioned, I winced when you said that Powell was being disingenuous. I guess that's a sort of weak one. Powell probably doesn't even understand the simplest points about how he shafted poor people and how, with his lockdown, and how he doesn't even look at that, how low interest rates obviously hurt old people.
Really? You don't think he's aware of that?
Well, okay, what do I know? I'm speculating. It's just that he's so focused on his own mishegas that when somebody asks him a question from left field, he doesn't even think about it. He just dismisses it. But maybe I'm mistaken about him. I'll give him the benefit of the doubt, because we can't really know what goes on in his mind. But the point is that and then the other part of the inequality story is, of course, the increase in restrictive licensure on all levels, particularly shafting people who want to be manicurists, or as Ed Glazer said, you have to do more paperwork and more red tape to establish a bodega in the Bronx than to establish a software company. All of the ways in which it's been made difficult for people of limited means to get decent jobs, to have job mobility. And because I would extend that to lawyering, and one of my hobby horses, you should be able, a woman in the poor area can learn divorce law and housing law if she just apprentices herself to a law firm for about 6 months. Either us could too, and you don't have to go to high school, college, and law school to do these things. So if we really freed up now, of course, that would be a real revolution. But it used to be you didn't have to go to law school to be a lawyer. And of course, the increase in restrictive licensure, which is measurable, that's low-hanging fruit. That clearly is just insanity, and presumably anybody with any smarts should be able to understand it. So I'm discoursing maybe more generally around your point, but I tend to think that the ways in which the Federal Reserve exacerbates inequality are a little bit more subtle. And I would think that you too want to go for the low-hanging fruit, and you want to talk about the ways in which the Federal Reserve exacerbates economic instability, which of course does in turn exacerbate inequality. True enough. Right. But the economic instability is bad enough, and it's hard enough to explain that to people without getting into the subtleties of inequality. So I'm a little bit surprised that you are focused on the inequality point. I ducked your point about why do I say that it's being that the measurement of inequality has been exaggerated. Among other things, now does get back to the CPI. I had a display about that, which I was going to show, that if you believe the consumer price index and you match it up with the measure that the BLS has been putting out for decades, a somewhat flawed measure, but which they call average hourly earnings of non-supervisory and production workers, which they say is the bottom 4/5 non-supervisory and production workers. The BLS, Bureau of Labor Statistics, keeps posting a number in which they divide that measure of wages, average hourly earnings, by their own consumer price index. And I believe that it way exaggerates, the CPI way exaggerates, certainly over a 30-year period, the price inflation, and that if they only used a couple of other measures, they would show that there really has been fairly tangible progress in real average hourly earnings. So people cite numbers like that from the vaunted Bureau of Labor Statistics using its own CPI. And the scandal about that is that this consumer price index has been revised. Now gets into the red meat you may want to talk about. But starting in the 90s, they started to revise it so that it would be so that it meant that the measured inflation slowed a bit. They revised it down so that it wouldn't be so that measured inflation would slow a bit. But they could not revise it historically. Normally, at the Bureau of Economic Analysis for GDP or in any other measure, a statistical agency, when it does a revision, then it does retrospective revisions in order to keep the series consistent. But the reason why the Bureau of Labor Statistics did not do that is because we live in a crazy world in which hundreds of billions of dollars worth of private sector contracts, including maintenance payments for divorce, child support payments, other contracts, are tied to the official CPI. And if they were to revise it historically, we'd have a rash of lawsuits. Then people would look at the new CPI and say, hey, I got cheated. So they leave the old CPI unrevised, and yet they have the temerity to use this unrevised, this CPI, which is discontinuous, to deflate average hourly earnings. That, by the way, clues you into the fact that the Bureau of Labor Statistics is still a sort of progressive, sort of left-wing oriented institution that prefers to exaggerate price inflation. Why? Because it tends to show that the working man is still getting shafted, which is basically their belief. The working man is always getting shafted, according to the leftists, no matter what occurs. So that maybe segues into the CPI, but I'm just using that as an example. There are other more subtle cases, which I could get into, but I might take us far afield, about measures of inequality that are exaggerated. It sounds like that's an interview in itself. I could get into all aspects of it if you wanted to, but I think it would take us too far afield. At least I'm mentioning the CPI is relevant to that. So people look at this, people look at a measure of the increase in average hourly earnings, and it shows a very tepid increase. But if they were to use adjusted measures, they would find that the increase has been reasonably substantial, very different from what the Bureau of Labor Statistics publishes. And again, as I say, publishes a number that everybody knows has not been revised to be continuous, so that up until the 1990s, in their own opinion, the consumer price index was exaggerating inflation, because they have since revised their methods. So, I mean, that's a brief answer to your question, but probably we shouldn't get too much into it.
Well, I think the reverse. I think we should get into that now, but I'm just going to touch on the previous point, because you said, I'm surprised, you're looking at kind of the core of inequality coming from central bank intervention or whatever. And there's other low hanging fruit that can account for inequality. And I would say the ones you mentioned are more in pockets, whether it's, regulatory or policy difference and stuff like that, versus the core essence of wealth, which is money creation, right? That's where we have to look for the broadest effect. And I would just say this, because I do want to get into CPI stuff. But to succinctly just say that, yes, I think, government intervention, let's take a very simple example like bailouts, creates inequality, because you're taking, that the money that the government derives, they're taking it from the value of the economy as a whole, and they're redirecting it toward bailing out Boeing, for example. And the people that benefit the most from that are shareholders of Boeing, executives, et cetera. So you're extracting wealth from the economy and rediverting it there. And so I think that has a wealth redistribution effect. And I think in effect, it spurs inequality. That type of economic intervention broadly speaking, I mean, that's the government is in effect a wealth redistribution mechanism, and it does so predicated on its own ideologies, imperatives, people's parties and people that it's pandering, et cetera, et cetera. What the government does, it withdraws wealth from people that create wealth, and they redistribute it based on a number of different variables. And I think that level of intervention, broadly speaking, over time creates inequality. But finally, just to say that the reason why central bank money creation creates inequality is because certain people are less capable of keeping pace with inflation than others. Again, another very simple example. If I'm a kind of paycheck to paycheck person, and I don't have many savings, much savings, whatever I do have is in cash, then I am completely subject to the effects of inflation. Things at the grocery store become more expensive, the money is debased, et cetera, et cetera. Whereas if I'm a wealthier person, then I'm able to hold only as much cash as I need for expenses, and the rest of my savings I can put in, and this is typically the case, I put in assets or investments that help me mute the effects of inflation, if not grow my wealth. And so both of those things, whether I'm just keeping pace with inflation better than the paycheck to paycheck person, or I'm growing my wealth by getting yield on my money in some capacity, stocks, bonds, real estate, whatever, then both of those things are causing greater inequality between me and that paycheck to paycheck person.
Well, those points are well taken. And in a way, I think you and I are going to arrive, if we actually explored it in great detail, we could probably account for about 160% of the reason for inequality. I'm not sure that I would necessarily agree with you that what you're apparently implying, which is that the central bank accounts for like 80% of the story, is probably what you seem to be suggesting. Let me mention one other thing, which I hesitate when I'm debating people about it, and I've got a big left-wing audience. I like to invite those people to my debates because I think they would especially benefit from what people like me and people like you have to say. Then the other striking thing about inequality is the inequality of work. Just having a job. You mentioned the paycheck part of it. And by the way, everything you said is well taken about your points about exacerbating inequality. But bear one thing in mind that stares you in the face. Interestingly enough, the Census Bureau actually publishes every year a breakdown of household income in fifths, in quintiles, and then it talks about how many people in each quintile on average actually work. And you find a perfect positive correlation. Amazingly, the average number of people who work in the top 20% is 2.2, over 2.1, 2.2, actually have a job. In the bottom 10, 20%, it's 0.4%. Or put another way, if you simply look at the quintiles, you find that it seems to be mostly explained by the fact that whether you're working or not. One would think that if you want to climb out of poverty, you want to improve your income, get a job. Well, then the next quintile, a little fewer than one people have a job. It turns out those rich people, the top 20%, their secret is that more than two of them work in each of the households on average. And this did not used to be the case. The poor actually used to have jobs. And so that's the huge gorilla in the room that Charles Murray and others have commented on work disincentives fostered by the welfare state that continue to this day, and that really are a major explanation for the whole problem. And the fact that we have so many people now, the labor force participation rate of prime age men is way down. So simply getting a goddamn job. If we actually corrected for that and said, let's say that everybody had two people in the household with a job, we would cure a considerable amount of the inequality in this country. So that's also pretty major. The welfare state.
I think that's major.
Yeah.
But I think it's definitely an influence. But once you're in the game, I think the same forces play on you. So let's say all these people get jobs. Yeah. Depending on what types of jobs they get and the level of the income they start, they enter the game, and automatically these forces that I articulated are playing on them. So the ones that are maybe earning less and find more difficult to keep pace with inflation, they move toward, the one side, and those who have excess and are able to protect themselves from inflation move toward the other, even accounting for both having jobs. But what I will say, and I think this gets under discussed dramatically, is the suppressive effect. I mean, I think monetary debasement, monetary inflation is going to have a lot of these effects anyways, but I do think we exacerbate it tremendously and prohibit people from more capably being able to mitigate the effects of it by having minimum wage. Because it keeps people out of the labor force, obviously, because it makes fewer jobs, and it prohibits people from taking jobs that they might otherwise do at a certain rate. And as to your very point, that means that more people are in the category that you described where they don't have a job, and less people are in the category where they do have a job. And that, kind of as at the outset, keeps people from being able to being able to mitigate the effects of this monetary debasement.
Well, I think the different then you've almost conceded a little, so to speak, to the extent that you and I even disagree about anything. Everything you've said about the central bank and inflation is well taken, and so but you did want to pursue this, which is fine with me. You acknowledge my point about work, and then you mentioned minimum wage, which of course is the other point I would have mentioned as well. It's also low-hanging fruit, although a little bit difficult for progressives to completely understand, and so I sometimes stay away from it. I only want to mention one point, which is that if you actually look at the life cycle, and you look at people who start at the bottom, start at minimum wage or sub-minimum wage jobs, if you just continue to stay in the labor force, you will then the longitudinal data indicate that your real income, inflation-adjusted income, will double in about 20 to 25 years. And this came from a bleeding heart economist, by the way, who told me this because he wanted to stress that people, the blue collar, the people of limited means workforce, they will double their income in about 20 to 25 years. But that means by the time they're in their 40s, they plateau. Now, you and I, of course, we look forward to plateauing when I was 60. So therefore, he pointed out that it's limited. But if you continue to work, you continue to have a job, you'll become a supervisor. So therefore, you will stay ahead of inflation. You'll double your income in real terms. So there's opportunity there. But again, your point is well taken as well. I mean, and again, I would even say that if you have a lot to point out about this, about the central bank and inequality, then I'm interested in that. I think my understanding is a bit underdeveloped in this regard, and you've been educating me a bit about being more aware of that. Certainly, there was a witty point made about the so-called trickle down effect. I forget by this. Actually, this guy's a bit of a comic, but he was quoting Obama and others in belittling the so-called trickle down effect. The idea that if we give money to the rich, then it will trickle down to the poor. That really, there was never really a viewpoint of nobody ever used the term, but that's what the progressives think is the so-called trickle down effect that supply side is subscribed to. Give money to the rich and it will go to the poor. So and Obama said, well, it doesn't work. It's out of we can't do that. And then this guy said, yeah, it doesn't work, but why don't you just walk over to the Federal Reserve and tell them that it doesn't work? What the heck do you think they're doing? They're basically giving money to those rich bastards, and they think it's going to trickle down to the poor. That they are practicing trickle down effect, and you say it doesn't work. You might be right. So all of those points are well taken.
Yeah, and just to put a capstone on that, because I imagine a lot of people listening will wonder the relevance between a system like we have now and a sound money system, and of course the one that I mostly promote, entirely promote, which is Bitcoin, is that because this is a problem of twofold. One is the type and nature of the money, and the two is how it's directed, created, and how it flows and who controls the flows. And so that obviously bestows an advantage. If I control the creation and flow of money, I can give it to my friends. I can put it through, I get to determine that. As you just said, why don't you just go tell Obama and say, stop, inserting it at the top basically and insert it at the bottom or the center or whatever. So that conveys an undue advantage. But the thing is this, a part of this process will still continue under a sound money system for one reason. It just will be, it'll be muted. So if I have a sound money, let's say a deflationary currency, or let's just say it's not inflationary, it's maintains its value. Just a hypothetical.
Oh, value. Okay, now you see you're misusing those terms. I
Well,
try to teach
okay.
you. It's a
Okay.
flat, it's neither inflationary nor deflation. Bitcoin is flat. It's not. It doesn't grow. It doesn't contract. Right.
Right. Let's use that definition.
Yeah.
In a society based on a money like that, the people who are able to save at a higher rate, the non-paycheck to paycheck people, will still be able to increase their wealth. They will be able to make their capital work for them. They'll be able to derive yield through investments of various kinds, versus the paycheck to paycheck people, which won't be able to do that. So you'll still have more than likely, as far as I can see, and a type of inequality. But the difference is that paycheck to paycheck person won't simultaneously be losing value in their savings as they are now. So the difference is now people are able to gain yield, or the main difference is one party is gaining yield while the other party is basically losing. Whereas under a sounder money system like Bitcoin, I think you'll still get people who gain yield, but the people who just decide to save in the currency or who are forced to live paycheck to paycheck won't be losing so much as a result of that, because their money won't be being debased, on an ongoing and a perhaps increasing scale.
Yeah. Well, there's of course you caused me to think about what will happen to the life cycle of the bottom half of the population. We stipulate that they all have a job, they're paycheck to paycheck, as you suggest. They're raising a family. I think it actually is a bit of an open question, because we don't really have, at least for the U.S., an historical precedent. In the old days, it was really that you depended on your children to support you. I mean, first of all, there wasn't a whole lot of old age to look forward to. All kinds of questions really about that. I say that even though I could speculate that if we don't have Social Security, if we don't have the government falsely indicating to people that they can be adequately supported in their old age, I think that will begin to fade in about 20 years because of what I said. It's unaffordable. It's affordable now. Medicare is actually killing a lot of old people anyway, but they still like it. But 20 years from now, it's going to begin to fade. So what will happen? Might people have more children because those children will have a role in taking care of them? We don't really know. But or indeed as well, if I may introduce another point, if we actually do have a Bitcoin economy, I think we can double our output every 10 years. And those paycheck to paycheck people probably will find the ability to have some savings out of their paycheck. And if you work from your 20s up to your 50s or 60s, even a paycheck to paycheck person who saves a little bit can still get by. Look, my father, who was raised came of age in the Great Depression, he actually went on to become a millionaire. When he did my taxes every year, I hadn't saved any money. He said, look, as my friend Heshe once advised me, always save something, even if it's as little as $1 a week. You and I may be a little ahistorical. My father came from a Depression era, and yet those people were putting money away. I had grandparents who were immigrants, poor immigrants. My grandfather worked as a waiter, lost his job in the 30s, then worked as a dishwasher, supporting a family of 4, then went back to waitering, then retired, died in his early 70s, and he and his wife, they left $6,000. And that in 1950 money. Mm-hmm. How the heck did these people manage to have $6,000 in the bank accumulated? Just maybe they were Jews, admittedly. It's just right, political. But all I'm saying is that you might, I think you're maybe somewhat exaggerating the capacity of paycheck to paycheck people to responsibly save some money over time. That does build up. So I just want to open up that point, even though, again, so therefore you might even be granting too much in the Bitcoin economy. Because once you factor in economic growth, larger incomes, and once you factor in the consideration that people will have more planning for the future if they're less dependent on the false promise of government supporting them in their old age.
Absolutely that. And I think, to answer the question, yes, of course, people will work hard and save. I think what I'm saying is that the forces working against people attempting to save are greater now than they were in your father's era. And I think they'd be better in, a Bitcoin denominated world. And so, yes, climbing out of that virtuous paycheck to paycheck cycle would be easier. Of course, everybody has to start there. And if the degree to which you want to climb out of it is predicated on where you're starting from, your work ethic, your determination, et cetera, all those different variables. It's just to say, how easy is the system making it, or how difficult is the system making it for an individual sufficiently motivated to do so? That's the big question. I think today we're in a space where it's perhaps harder than ever.
Yes. No, indeed. And I grant, and I think, again, you've taught me a few things here. And I think that broadly speaking, I grant your point that an inflationary economy is indeed skewed toward the better off, and does exacerbate inequality, and for sure. And if you and I, quibble about how much of a role it plays or not, then it's merely a quibble. I take your broad point.
Yeah, Gene, let's break into some of the CPI stuff. And I think maybe the best way is I'll just ask you, I have a couple questions regarding it, and I'm hoping that those questions will kind of lead into other things that you might want to discuss, rather than trying to frame it up on some, in some particular way. So
Sure.
First off, how do you think this, or how has the CPI calculation, how does it influence the GDP calculation? And how does it influence the policy that's predicated on GDP calculation? I know there's many different ways you could go here. So tell me what first comes to your mind when you think of those.
I have to think about how I can work in my hobby horse into this answer. Let me see now.
Or just tell me whatever you want about the CPI and we'll go from there.
All right, well, okay. Thank you. Okay, so I've got a fork in the road here. Two options here. Well, I do think that there are a lot of free market people, most free market people that I like and respect, especially people of an Austrian bent, believe that the CPI understates inflation. That we really haven't had 2% inflation. We've had 4 and 5%. And one of those, and I guess of course this now ties in with GDP. One of those is John Williams, an economist who puts out something called Straight Shooter, I think. I've spoken with him a bit. I emailed with him a bit, and so people tend to swear by him. And he seems to think that inflation has really been running like 5%. And then I do a reductive ad absurdum on that. If that inflation has been running not 2% but 5%, and as you know, GDP is calculated in nominal terms, nominal dollars, and then it's deflated by a price index. Now, the technical relationship between the consumer price index and the GDP deflator is a bit different, because GDP is measuring more than just consumer spending. And by the way, just to get into another technical wrinkle, the deflator for consumer spending is used by the Bureau of Economic Analysis, not the Bureau of Labor Statistics. The Bureau of Economic Analysis long ago decided that they were not going to use the CPI construct to deflate consumer spending. They used something called the Personal Consumption Expenditures Deflator, the PCE. And they use, I think, more sophisticated methods, and their PCE, the Personal Consumption Expenditures Deflator, for the consumption part of GDP, shows a slower inflation than the CPI does. And I think their methods are better. So I'm already saying that the CPI exaggerates inflation for that very reason, because I think the PCE is a more accurate measure. But getting back to John Williams, John Williams says 4 to 5%. I think sometimes he says 6%. But if it's more than 4%, as I try to explain to people, look at nominal GDP before inflation. Nominal GDP before inflation has been rose by 4% in the 10.5-year expansion that just ended, rose by almost exactly 4% a year. And so if we believe that inflation, and again, CPI, GDP, they're related. When John Williams says 5 to 6% inflation, he means almost all measures of inflation. That means that if we apply a 5% deflator to a 4% increase, we get a 1% per year decline. So he is, by implication, literally saying that there was no expansion in the 10.5-year period through the fourth quarter. We actually had a contraction. And part of the problem with that is that we have so many other indications, as even if you want to be completely cynical about gross domestic product and how it's measured, we have so many other indications that there was an expansion. We have independent data from the unemployment insurance claims that there was a huge increase in the number of people employed. The GDP is mostly the private sector, and therefore, if the private sector is rapidly increasing employment, business formations, every other independent measure is increasing. Are they that crazy? They're increasing during a contraction. So I have had one conversation with somebody who literally believes that there was no expansion over the previous 10.5 years, that there was a contraction. But I take it you don't believe that. You believe there was some kind of economic expansion. And again, if there was an economic expansion, then it would have run about 2%. And that means that that the inflation rate of about 2% is valid. And so that's why I use that broad brush example to sort of try to throw doubt into the minds of people who would march in the other direction and say that the CPI understates inflation. Now, I believe it overstates inflation, and for many reasons that I can't explain. And let me start actually with the famous John Vallis gaffe, which now is enshrined in history, where you just briefly said, it was only about a few nanoseconds, John, where you said, and it ignores college tuition. Yeah, so I pounced. That was the only thing I remember from that interview. I don't remember what else you were talking about. And so I sent you the subcomponent of the CPI on college tuition, and I showed you that for any period, any long run period you want to look at, that subcomponent was rising by over 6.5% a year. It increased 15-fold. The CPI was indeed tracking college tuition, and they showed it was increasing by 6.7% per year. So they were doing a fair amount of justice. But now let's get into why they are probably overstating the increase. And this gets into the broad problem, the bureaucratic problems that the Bureau of Labor Statistics faces, where they don't do as good a job as a private sector agency would do. So what are they faced with? They are actually looking at, the easy way to do it is just to look at sticker prices of college tuition. And so they show a 6.7% per year increase, a 15-fold increase. But it would take a lot of research to delve into what's really been happening on the college level for the last 20, 25 years. What's really been happening is that the colleges have a sticker price for the rich. And then they give all kinds of discounts, but they're not called discounts. They're called scholarships. They're called all kinds of other subtle things. So probably even if you asked the college, the people at the colleges who charge what the traffic will bear, they won't even give you straightforward information. So what's really been happening is that 6.7% a year has been exaggerated over the last 10, 15 years because people are getting huge discounts based on need, but they aren't presented as discounts. So, why is that happening? In that particular case, it's that we have a bureaucracy. We have the Bureau of Labor Statistics, but they have limited resources, limited imagination. They're just supposed to do a job. So they are overstating the increase in college tuition for that reason. And broadly speaking, in terms of what you're facing, even if you and I were going to have all the resources needed to do a good job, you're facing a number of problems. Number one, you're facing an entrepreneurial economy where over the last 20 years especially, there's been a whole lot of discounting. And it takes, even of the same good, and it takes a whole lot of being faster on your feet to track it. And they miss it all the time. They miss the Walmart effect. Walmart started to sell groceries, and I could explain why there was a problem. This was thoroughly documented. Walmart sold brand name groceries, the same brand name groceries that were being sold in the competition, but they sold it for like 20% less. And that was never registered by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. Because of their bureaucratic methods, they just linked to the Walmart prices when Walmart became part of their sample, and they never registered the 20% discount. Then there's the big problem that nobody knows how to solve: technology, technological improvements, technological differences. And the most egregious case of that, by the way, getting back to the Walmart effect, they are also missing the Amazon effect. They're having the same problem. They're just linking Amazon's lower prices. Uber started to charge less for a cab ride, and they never registered that, the Uber discount. So all of that entrepreneurship, you really have to be zealous in order to track it, and they don't with the CPI. And that, by the way, is a problem with the personal consumption expenditure deflator. But now we haven't gotten into the biggest problem of all, the smartphone. What are you going to do about the smartphone, John, if you're in charge of the Bureau of Labor Statistics? And by the way, it really blindsided them, caught them unawares. Do you know that it was really during the Great Recession, 08 and 09, I had to be reminded of that the smartphone revolution started? Mm-hmm. I never used one of those old phones. One of those, you could do texting, you could do phoning on it. And then suddenly they're bringing out the smartphone that can do 9 other things. Suddenly, I don't use a watch anymore. I don't use a flashlight. Obviously I listen to you, John, because mostly on my smartphone. So it can do all of these things, and it costs more. But it makes so many other items no longer necessary. How do you incorporate that into your consumer price index? That technological revolution. And what they did was they simply threw up their hands and they linked it to the old cell phone. They linked it. They registered neither a price increase or price decrease. They just linked it. Now, I think that you would agree that given all of the things that this smartphone can do, it was essentially a price decrease. So when I want to read you, all the skepticism that comes out about how, what should a price index do? Well, why not just be honest? Why not just take, the basket of goods and track it over time? Don't talk about substitution. I'm going to get that into that. Why is it so difficult for them to do? Well, it's difficult for them to do because as a practical matter, they have to trace all kinds of discounting. They have to worry when a new furniture store opens up. They have to link it with an old furniture store. But more especially, they have to worry about the problem of new technologies. Or to use the garden variety example that I used to be my favorite, since I'm not really learned about computers, is that there was a point at which you were selling a car. And then the next year you came out with the same car, except the same car had power steering and power brakes. So it's a much safer car to drive, and yet it's the same car. So is that, how do you link those two? How do you register that in the consumer price index? So therefore, in an economy in which goods are changing all the time, in which technology is changing all the time, in which discounting on the part of entrepreneurs is especially rife, even with the best of intentions, you are bound to overstate. And then if you compound it with the bureaucracy of the Bureau of Labor Statistics that does things by rote, then it's going to get even worse, because they're going to miss the Walmart effect, they're going to miss the Amazon effect, and they're going to miss the Uber effect. So that's in broad brushstrokes why the consumer price index overstates. But by the way, it's not huge. It's a little less than 1% a year by most estimates. So if your inflation rate is 5%, 6%, then 1% ain't great. But if your inflation rate, the real inflation rate, is registered as 2%, and then you have 1%, and then if you take it over a 30-year period, that 1% can make a huge difference in terms of how you calculate the increase. That 1% can build up. And that's why the price index isn't interested me for the most part, because the direction from 1 month to the next, or from 1 year to the next, is not a big deal if you're mismeasuring with the same kind of bias. but the mismeasurement over a 10, 20, 30-year period becomes fairly serious in terms of measuring wages, salaries, incomes, and so on. So I probably said enough for you to comment, more than enough, so I'll shut up for a moment. But other things I wanted to get into that are much more contentious, having to do with the substitution effect. But that's the broad story. Oh, by the way, I just want to say one other thing, John, which is that why do people tend to think that inflation is unsustainable? Social Security recipients tend to think so. You know, their Social Security paycheck is tied to the inflation rate. I think that there is a kind of bias in the way people look at prices. That if you have a 2% increase in prices overall, then a lot of prices are going up by 5%. Some are going down. Some are flat. And so I think that people tend to notice the prices that are going up more than they notice the prices that are going down. And I think that's the reason why there's an honest, even among non-free market and Austrian types, there's that bias. And I guess among our friends, there's a tendency to believe that the government is monolithic and not to realize that it really isn't, and that it's quite possible for our government agencies to be exaggerating price inflation because that's the way they bureaucratically work.
Right.
Yeah.
A lot there. We'll get into the more contentious issues that you were just referring to, and perhaps, you know, by another name of the hedonic substitution arguments in a moment.
Well, hedonic is something else, John.
Right, but I want to get into that as well.
Okay, but way I did mention it already, but go on.
But so one of the big ones that's getting a lot of focus these days, and you touched on it there, is the the effect of technology in bringing down prices for similar or new services, right? So
a smartphone, John.
Right.
You know what the most difficult one of all? You don't need a flashlight anymore. You don't need a compass. You don't need a watch.
Yes, that's my point.
Right.
So
How do you do that?
We have technology and innovation putting downward pressure on prices for these services.
And I told you, John, the way the Bureau of Labor Statistics dealt with it. They said, we're not dealing with it. We're just linking it with the old clip-on phone.
So here's my question, Gene. You have that large and a substantial trend, and then you have the trend of monetary inflation. And so one of the questions that comes up in my mind is the monetary inflation keeping the full quality of life benefits from this technological innovation from consumers? So is the full effects of this technological innovation being dampened from the perspective of the consumer due to the counterbalancing effect of monetary inflation? So to put it more simply, would there be more benefit derived from this deflationary technological effect if it wasn't counterbalanced by monetary inflation? Will we be deriving more benefit?
Well, I guess this gets back to what I said several hours ago, John. And earlier, I said that really, just to pick a number, the free market, the free unfettered market has been giving us 5% per year price declines, and the monetary inflation has turned it into a 1.5% increase. So they've been giving it. So indeed, the answer to your question is a resounding yes. We would have been benefiting from declining prices of 5% a year. But although, by the way, for what it's worth, the goods, you can separate the oil price indexes into goods versus services, and they're approximately about the same in terms of the balance. The goods part has been flat. It's only the services part that's been increasing. But even for the goods part to be flat is ridiculous. The goods part is probably really, in a free market, been declining by 8 or 9%. But because of the monetary inflation, they've been keeping it flat. So indeed, obviously, if we didn't have monetary inflation, all of this stuff would be much more affordable. We'd be going, everything would be cheaper by 5% a year, not more expensive.
So you mentioned that, obviously part of your core premise of this discussion is that the government has overshot CPI and inflation in many instances.
Consistently does because of their methods. Yeah.
Right. What are the negative effects of doing so in your mind? And so I guess what I'm looking for is, what are the incentives the government has to either under or over report inflation?
Well, see, that gets into an interesting story. The point about the key point I tried to make earlier then about incentives is that a bureaucrat wants to do less with more. I mean that when you go over the different categories of of overstatement and things that the CPI has missed, then most of those, almost all of those, seem to have something to do with simply bureaucratic laziness, not trying to intervene in your sampling technique when you pick up Walmart and when almost all the brand name items are 20% cheaper, and then you don't register that and you just link it, or then being so daunted and so blindsided and surprised by the move to smartphones. The smartphone revolution just happened again during the Great Recession. The people just basically threw away those clips, those folding phones, the cell phones, and they start buying the smartphone. And so, and then realizing, well, you rationalize it, the smartphones were more expensive than the cell phones. So you could sort of rationalize it in your mind and say, well, it's more expensive, it's pricier, but we're not going to register that. We're just going to link it and make it flat. But obviously, if the smartphone can do about 12 things that the cell phone can't, that's laziness. So therefore, what I'm trying to say is that that the more so to speak sophisticated view of government is that much of what it does is simply due to bureaucratic incompetence. But with that said, certainly the people at the Bureau of Economic Analysis who do the GDP accounts, they decided that they're going to take the inputs from the BLS, the price inputs, but they're going to construct their own price index because they want to be more accurate. And so so that's a little bit of smarts. Also, especially this happened, you perhaps remember or know about the Boston Commission when there was concern in the mid-90s that Social Security was costing the government too much. That's when the interaction between the Clinton administration and certain economists gave rise to the Boston Commission to try to get the Bureau of Labor Statistics to recalculate the consumer price index so that they would be a little bit more realistically in line with actual price increases. And that was strictly motivated by the government wanting to save money. Therefore, save money on Social Security. And to some extent, it is doing so. But only some of what the Boston Commission proposed was implemented. The CPI now overstates inflation by less than it used to, but it still does. So there was only a certain number of things that could be done. So if you want to use your pure model, then you would say that if the government is simply motivated on saving money on entitlements, and if so many of those entitlements are tied to inflation, then it would presumably want to modify the consumer price index. But even that gets subtle. There's a
downward, though, right? They'd want to modify it downward. Yeah.
Thank you. Downward is what I meant to say, John. Thank you. Yes, indeed. But the point is that you even have to ask yourself a more subtle question, which is that most politicians just want to kick the can down the road. And the other, by the way, downside of measuring it. Oh no, that's not true. Yeah, if you measure it downward, you get a little bit more of GDP growth. So there is some motivation to do that. But by and large, the bureaucracy rules, and by and large, politicians really don't care about what's going to happen when they're no longer in office. And so the fact that this spending is increasing is usually of no great concern. So you really don't have, in my view, if you do sort of the public choice theory of government, public choice is perhaps still chosen, but it's distinguished from private choice. People make private choices, but then if you're in government, you make a public choice. And so the public choice motivations are very different. And why do you really care if entitlements are costing a lot when you can afford them now? And that's a worry 10 years from now. And who that cares? You can blame that on whatever guy's in charge then. It's not going to be you. So therefore, there's not a huge motivation to modify it. And the bureaucratic motivation is great. But on top of that, if we were to talk about a world in which we had private sector calculations of a consumer price index, even they would have headaches and problems, because ultimately we don't even know quite what to do with the smartphone. We will always make mistakes. And I think the mistakes will usually be to exaggerate inflation a bit. we can do a much better job. But at the end of the day, even the very idea of a price index is part art and part science. It's clearly there's a lot of guesswork, a lot of art in between.
And it seems to be a manifestation of the central financial planning, central bank planning, you kind of a required tool in their tool set that, as you said at the outset, maybe we would still have, there would still be demand in certain instances for understanding what more broadly the increase in prices or decrease in prices, the change in consumer goods in a given year. Maybe there would be demand for that in pockets in a non-centrally planned economy.
We had a lot of divorces. We had alimony payments and child support. If prices are falling, there would be a motivation. Business contract. If you have prices falling, then there's a lot of motivation possibly to keep track of that and have contracts tied to it. So that was what I was positing. But getting to your point, the Federal Reserve basically plays with what were they doing? They were saying, well, our target is a 2% inflation rate. But partly there was a certain understanding, certainly on Greenspan's part, that the inflation rate is a bit exaggerated. So they're targeting it in the near term. And so if you talk about what is the history of the consumer price index, is in left-wing progressive government. That the Bureau of Labor, why is the Bureau of Labor Statistics looking at prices? Because there was a concern on the part of labor-oriented Bureau of Labor Statistics about wages, and the big use initially was in 1917, 1918 to tie wages in the shipyards to prices, because you're always going to get price inflation during a war for reasons that we understand, and they didn't want strikes, and so they tied it to they put out the consumer price index in order to hike wages in line with prices. And then Social Security came along, and then the inflation hit in the 70s, and because of that, there was left-wing legislation to get the Social Security tied to the price index. So it basically serves left-wing ends, Bob.
Right.
John. But if you want to get to the Federal Reserve is mostly looking at the oscillations of the price index. They're sort of counting angels on the head of a pin. They couldn't achieve 2% inflation, all that crap. So they're really a minor player in a way in the use of the P. They, by the way, mostly Greenspan started the precedent of mostly looking at the personal consumption expenditures deflator, the PCE, which is put out monthly, although it comes out about 3 weeks later than the CPI. And by the way, this whole business of a monthly index is also a little crazy. Having to generate it monthly also is a big strain. Probably a private sector would never do that.
Yeah. My point is just that in a free market economy, and we won't get into what is necessary to facilitate that, but the CPI seems to me like it's just a tool that's either required or there's a lot of uses for it in a centrally planned, centrally banked economy. But in a free market economy, other than the specific use cases that you reference, let's say in divorce proceedings or things like that, but would that even would there be a demand for it? I don't think broadly in a free market economy that's not centrally controlled and manipulated, it would be required. It wouldn't be used as a policy instrument because that policy around those issues would not be constructed. Maybe you need a way to assess price changes and cost of living in certain free market behaviors and activities and interactions. And in those cases, you would probably get far more relevant price indexes, probably on a local level, because that's where it's more relevant to the people with who are using it in a given market.
Okay, I mostly agree with that. I guess the only way in which I would modify your point, instead of saying centralized planning, I would put a finer point on it and say that in an inflationary economy, in an economy in which the money supply expands faster than goods, in which you're going to continue to have rising prices as a result, and in which you have periodic bouts of double-digit price inflation, and then always the risk of accelerating to triple digits. And then if on top of that you have fixed entitlements that the government gives out in terms of Social Security, then you're going to have interest in price indexes, especially. But so it's not so much the centrally plan. Admittedly, the Federal Reserve, you're right, it's central planning agency, and it does target price inflation. So in that sense, you're right. But really, the main use and the main motivation is the trillions of dollars worth of contracts that are tied to it in an inflationary economy. And you're right, of course. I agree that in an economy in which there's Bitcoin, in an economy in which prices, as conventionally measured, generally don't move up or down in any noticeable way, even though, of course, that's such a generalization. You probably won't have too much of an interest in tracking price changes. But in a Bitcoin economy, where prices would continually decline, I could see demand for it, just as you grant. But there's lots of long-term contracts. We don't know what the divorce rate will be like, John. But the point is, I could still see it being a fairly good business to turn out reliable price indexes. And I certainly agree with you as well. This gets into another wrinkle involving the CPI that clearly, if you live in San Francisco, where, as I looked it up, where the San Francisco area generally, which includes Oakland, rents were going up by 4% a year, more than doubled in 20 years, as distinct from other parts of the country where rents don't increase as much. I'm just saying that clearly you are correct in saying that, implying at least, that we have somewhat different price inflation experiences depending upon where we're living. And so probably if you and I were to develop a business in which we sell our price indexes to lawyers and contract writers and so on, we would probably develop an index that's attuned to the market. Although again, we would still have a lot of difficult headaches in trying to track what really goes on with prices. But we would do a better job than the Bureau of Labor Statistics does.
Yeah, and I think perhaps a non-contentious statement would be, even if you still would require there'd be use cases for a price index, the lower the volatility in the underlying currency, the less demand there would be for price indexes, just because the change would be less dramatic.
Well, I think we would put out our price index. Maybe yearly would be good enough. No more than quarterly, certainly.
Right.
Yearly would probably be good enough. If you're talking about long-term contracts, it would be a yearly thing that we would put them out for, and there would be a change each year. And I think some people would buy the service. Absolutely. Yeah.
So, Gene, we're getting towards the end here now.
I didn't even get it.
I know. So I'm going to give you a chance now. So tell me the things that you've been waiting to discuss, because what I want to finish with is just a few quick points to get your take on how the CPI's influence on a couple of different things, if we haven't touched on them yet, or if you don't touch on them now when you get into what you wanted to discuss. But
maybe I should go faster than not show my displays. But you mentioned hedonics, and I guess we could have gotten into that, and I guess I should touch on it. I already did touch on it. The hedonic idea, and why it's called hedonics, pleasure. It died with this guy named Zvi Griliches, who called it hedonics, and he never explained why he did call it that. But it basically gets back to my simple tale of two cars. They're identical in every way, except I wrote this for the older folks at Barron's and for myself as well, just to simplify it, because it can sometimes get complicated with computers. Is that one car has power steering and power brakes, and the other car doesn't. And so how do you price them? Well, hedonics, how do you record that in the consumer price index? If they both cost the same, if they both cost the same, does that mean that prices have gone down or up? Well, actually, that's an incorrect statement, because what does happen all the time when a new improved version of a good is brought out is that if it scores, if it actually gets a clientele, people to buy it, then what will happen is that the car without the power brakes and power steering that's still on the market, let's say for the sake of making it easy, that's still being manufactured, it will immediately go to a discount. It will immediately sell for less than it used to, because it's actually being competed, because its competition is the one with power steering and power brakes. And the hedonic method is a strictly empirical method to try to gauge what the value of those extra items are to consumers in terms of what they're willing to pay. And so my point is that when we back up, we should grant that we have to make some accommodation for the fact that the two cars are different. They're somewhat different items, and we have to incorporate that. And when we find that goods are being improved all the time, then we have to recognize that we have to deal with that problem. And people who criticize hedonics apparently have not read up on it. They don't realize that if a new item is brought out for a personal computer or for a car or for a smartphone, and it bombs on the market, the hedonics will give it a bomb. The hedonics is an empirical method. It's dependent on information, on price information about the old versions and the good version and the new versions. And it will only record an improvement if indeed the market shows that you and I want to pay less for the car without the power steering and power brakes. If nobody cared about the power steering and power brakes, then it would not have registered. So what I'm saying is that it's a useful method.
How does it price the quality improvement?
As I say, based on empirical behavior of consumers. To get now back to my smartphone example, when the smartphones came out, then what happened was that the old cell phones plummeted in price because they were still being sold, they were still being marketed, and they plummeted in price. Because now there was a niche market for them. There are people, there's always, this gets back, of course, to the fact that the consumer price index or any price index is just a generalization about most people's behavior. What happened was that these cell phones, those cell phones plummeted in price, and people were then only buying the smartphone, even though it was more expensive because it had so many more items. So it's only a point I want to emphasize is that this is an empirical technique. It will not score an improvement unless there is tangible evidence that consumers are paying less for the old one and willing to pay a premium for the new one. So that is a measure of their utility. So again, this goes way back. That's all the hedonic method is. And what we have to recognize is that people who are stuck on the idea that you should just do all this creativity. What are you up to? Just choose a basket of goods and track it. Well, that's not what the market does. The market is constantly introducing improvements. And that was happening with the personal computer. Personal computer was introducing new items and people were paying for it, but only what they paid for. Now, indeed, I think that there is to some degree a resort on the part of the Bureau of Labor Statistics, since they too are limited, they don't always have the right data. I think that to some degree they do make a mistake by going the other route, by saying that the cost of the improvement, a cost-based analysis, that the cost of the power steering and power brakes is now going to be in our new measure. What it costs is the value to consumers. That's not how hedonics works. Hedonics only values it in terms of actual consumer purchases. But there are other methods that might make a mistake in that regard. But in any case, the hedonics does not. And again, all I want to establish is that technological improvements have got to be dealt with if you're going to have any kind of price index. And the method of hedonics if you have the data is a good one. It probably would have been, if you actually think of the smartphone, because the smartphone was not just the same damn car with the power steering, power brakes. It was like so many other things that there's almost like no satisfactory way to do it. But they did it. The Bureau of Labor Statistics did it in what was basically almost the worst possible way. They basically registered no improvement. So that's hedonics. But I want to get into just one final point and just maybe just address it in a summary fashion, because although I did prepare slides in order to explain it, this is perhaps the most difficult concept, and it has to do with substitution. In the case of the CPI versus the personal consumption expenditure deflator, it has to do with something called chain weighting. Now, I want to ask you, John, you're my student here. You got limes and you got lemons. Now, John, come on, pay attention. Limes and lemons. Okay, now you got limes and lemons, and I put a lime or a lemon in my vodka tonic every night. And so the point is that those are conceived of as close substitutes. And it was found that and of course there are many other kinds. There's nectarines and peaches. Easy examples. It was found that if the price of the limes went up in relation to the lemons, then people would start just buying the lemons and not the limes. So and vice versa. If the limes become cheaper, they'll buy limes. So in fact, there'll be a sort of disproportionate movement into the cheaper item. But partly that's old people doing that. So therefore, my point as far as that goes is that would you recognize that the idea that you look at goods that are sort of relative substitutes for each other, and that if consumers switch from one to the other, you sort of have to reweight. You can't, if the lemons go up in price in relation to the limes, and then if you simply register the full brunt of the increase in lemon purchases, when the purchase of lemons has collapsed and they're buying limes, then you probably want to be aware of that and recognize that they're substitutes and incorporate that. Right? As far as that goes,
to answer your question,
the limes and lemons riddle, John.
Well, to answer your question, I would say it would probably be wrong to record the net price increase of that, the change in dynamic, because of the behavior change of the consumer, because they've made that substitution, and as a result, they haven't felt the price increase. But I think there's also an interesting investigation here, and this is probably far too broad to interrupt our discussion here, but it does speak to the effect of price changes and all the different variables that influence them, and that is how much do economic incentives drive preferences. And so in this example, the economic incentive of, let's say, the lemons being more expensive than the limes have driven people to the limes. And I think we probably see that across the board in complex economies and societies, where that's why I think people focus so much on the different central bank interventions and other economic activity that does, and we focus on the effects of it because we realize how much it does change our incentives and change our preferences. Because as you say, for example, this is by no means exclusive, but why, fast food? If there was an increase in fast food, is it just because McDonald's has a tastier burger? Well, no, that may very well be the case, but it may also be the case that, if I've got $10 for my food for the week, and a steak is $10 and a McDonald's burger is $2, then I'm going to eat the McDonald's burger out of economic reality and the economic incentives that are inherent in that trade or that economic calculus. So
you're playing into my hands, John. You're playing into my hands. So because I butchered the first one. So you're a very smart student, but you're going to get an A on this one, John, because in a way you're anticipating my point. See, what I'm really saying is that, surprisingly, I gave an example. I sent out an example of beef and chicken, but it applies to almost everything. This is the way the chain weighting works. That the personal consumption expenditures deflator does it, and the PC and the CPI also does it for limes and lemons. This is what it does. It splits the difference. Maybe you can. I think this will be reasonably clear. I threw out an example in which you have chicken, beef, and wine in your basket. That's it. Chicken, beef, and wine. And then I said beef doubles in price. Beef doubles in price, and so how do you measure the impact of the doubling in price? See, you were touching on something that's important, John. You were saying indeed that what about those people are being priced out of the market because they can't afford the beef anymore? How about them? Let's take that into account, the loss of their utility. So what the chaining does is it splits the difference in this way. How does it split the difference? It says that what we're going to do is, first of all, look at how much beef, chicken, and wine were they buying before the doubling in price of beef, and how much beef, chicken, and wine were they buying afterwards. So what we know is that they're going to buy, on average, they, of course, being there, they're going to buy more chicken and less beef. And so I said they have the same $100 to spend, same limited income. So they're going to substitute chicken for beef. There'll be some beef, but it doubled in price. And so what the chaining says is that going forward, we want to take into account the fact that less beef is being purchased, but we also want to reflect the cataclysm, the catastrophe for people who like beef who can no longer afford it. And how do we do that? We're going to take the price increase in terms of the first period weights and record it. In other words, we're going to say in the second period, we want to know how much would they have to spend, how much of an increase in price would they have to incur if they kept the same beef chicken allocations, the same. Mm-hmm. And in the calculation I threw out, because I had an extreme example, I showed that the doubling of the price of beef would have brought a 63% increase in prices. And that's sort of like the way in which the standard idea has it, which is that you keep the weights fixed. What are you for tootsing around for? They bought so much beef, so much chicken, and now we want to know how much extra is going to cost when they have the same allocations. But they did substitute chicken for beef. And going forward, they're consuming less beef. And to some degree, those who could afford it do regard a certain amount of extra chicken as a trade-off. They're maximizing the utility. So you may not be satisfied by this, but we record that 63% increase. And then we work backward with period 2 weights. And we say, well, suppose they had period 2 weights, how much of an increase? They're buying less beef. Period 2 weights are going to apply for both period 1 and the current period. If you understand, they're now buying less beef and more chicken, but we want to see what would be the price increase if we just applied period 2 weights throughout retroactively and saw the increase in prices. So I got a 16% increase in price. Based upon the new weights, there's a 16% increase in price. Based upon the old weights, there's a 63% increase in price. And also, are we going to continue to assume that they have so much beef in their allotment going forward when they're obviously eating a lot less beef? But so what the chain weighting does is it takes the 16% and the 63%, and it does what is called a geometric mean. You probably know what that is, but it's basically an average. It takes the average of the 63% and the 16%. And I got a result of 34%. In other words, it will register it. It will indeed, going back to your point, the fact that people can't afford the limes or can't afford the lemons, as the case may be, is hurting. So we want to do a period 1 measure of that and keep the allocations constant so that we get the full brunt. That was the 63% increase I got. But then we want to see, well, according to the new weights, what is the price increase? Well, it's 16% from period 1, and we take an average and we get over 30%. So what I'm saying then is that I believe that this is the real touchy point, and in a way it touches upon an Austrian view. Let me use another interesting example. Let's just talk about a Caribbean vacation or a vacation in where you like to go. Where do you like to go? So the point is, if one vacation rises in price, then there might be a movement toward the other vacation. But we're gonna get the full brunt by period 1 weights by persecuting the prices with that full brunt with period 1 weights. But then people are going to Bali. There's some elasticity. They're not so loyal to it. And so what are we really talking about? What is the nature of our commodity? Is this a Caribbean vacation or a Bali vacation, or is it just a trip to a warm climate? But then speaking of the other side, we're talking about the price and elasticity of demand. The price of gasoline, there's practically no, the only substitution is that you're going to buy less of it. If the price of gasoline goes up, the price of oil, generally the price of fuel, then only in the very long term can there be adaptations. There, the period 1 weights and the period 2 weights will be very similar. But the point is that for many goods, it's really just having a good meal. And so, or in the case of the vacations, it's really just having a vacation. So there is, in many people's minds, almost everything is a lime versus a lemon. I don't know if you understand my point. My point is that in a way, this whole approach of chain weighting, which splits the difference, which says, let's take the full brunt of the price increase in terms of fixed weights, then work with period 2 weights and work backward and take that lower price increase and then do an average, is probably the best compromise we can come across. And Ron Paul misunderstood it. He didn't realize that that's the way it works. That is the way it works.
Right. So you're saying it's misguided to just take the price differential and say that your cost of living based on the existing preferences has gone up because it doesn't take into account the adaptation you may make based on the differential in prices?
Or I would say that in a way, the idea of the lime versus the lemon, or the peach versus the nectarine, where we almost regard those as like 98% perfect substitutes for each other, and 2% see a difference, is that, and in that case, we have an extreme where the purchase of lemons is really going to plummet, and the purchase of limes is an increase. Then in terms of the empirical data, if it's the chicken and the beef, or it's the one vacation versus another, we have imperfect substitutability, and that will pick up. And in a way, then the term substitutability is the key operator. How will people maximize their utility? And then in addition, what we're really ultimately talking about is the real question of how you define the subjectivity. We Austrians believe in subjective value. How do you define the subjectivity of what is being purchased? We have a broad array of things we can do on our vacation. We value some of them more than others. But the idea that we do a fixed weight for the Caribbean vacation, and then when the Caribbean vacation becomes more expensive, we assume everybody's still going to the Caribbean and not choosing an alternative. That
Right.
seems to be unrealistic. And bear in mind, however, that the chaining insists on incorporating into the calculation the full fixed weight brunt, but then averaging it with a retrospective brunt and taking an average. So that's why it actually is a fairly ingenious method for splitting the difference, albeit this is all an art and not a science. But
Understood.
Yeah.
Understood. I understand what you're saying. And it makes me wonder, while you're saying that, in the type of economy, monetary and financial system in which we find ourselves, which there is a high degree of centralized intervention through the creation and flows of money, a la central banks and the government. Does that create a scenario in which it's more likely that we substitute ourselves into a lower quality of life? Do you know what because the distortion of prices that method of monetary policy creates, does it not prefer rather, or have a preference for constantly looking for the cheaper to produce and consume goods? And will we find ourselves, and I think I'm going to steelman my own argument here, or the technological innovation and deflation argument is kind of in the background mitigating this, but will we substitute ourselves into a lower quality of life because of the increased pressure that the type of monetary policy and the money in which we use has on forcing us to find cheaper and cheaper substitutes for the things that we want?
Yeah, I have to think about that, John. I'm certainly sympathetic. I guess I would say first, the desire to do more with less, the entrepreneurial desire to discount,
will always be there.
Yeah, that's entrepreneurship. That's
right.
That's Bezos. That's Henry Ford, and that make it cheaper. You become a billionaire by most of the time, Bloomberg aside, by selling something that the masses want to buy. So that's going to be there, and so prices are going to be falling. And I mean, of course, in the example that I just cited, I guess I would have to say, well, the Caribbean vacation fell by 10%, but the Bali vacation fell by 30%. I would be talking probably in the reverse direction. And people are always looking for the cheaper alternative. So therefore, I think that's never going to stop. And I think obviously the ways in which the centrally planned economy, as you call it, and I would call it that as well, slows things down, makes cheaper prices more difficult. Incomes are generally rising, but I guess I would get back to your point and say that to the extent that we have inequality, then it means that those of us who earn a good income benefit much more from this than those of us who earn less. But I'm not sure I'm not sure about what you're getting at, that the idea that the inflationary economy necessarily means that, I mean, it's a good thing if people are looking for cheaper ways of producing the same thing. It's a good thing if people are looking for ways to produce better versions of the same thing. So all of that's good. So
Yeah, I think maybe one potential answer to my own question is that, you know, this substitute, this behavior that causes people to substitute is just, you know, a natural economic calculus that doesn't matter what bracket you're in, you're going to do. It's a matter of preference and economic reality that you find yourself in. I guess my question was simply that the inequality that we referenced before, the disparity in wealth, the economic and capital destruction to the extent that it occurs in a centrally planned economy as we have around the world through the central banks, will that be creating, I guess what I'm saying is, will that be creating more and more poverty? And as a result of that, that natural substitutive behavior that we just referenced is just going to lead people to demanding cheaper, lower quality substitutes kind of until, because that's the kind of economic imperative, because they're less wealthy, until we get to a point where the quality of goods and services broadly is of a lower quality. Articulated that somewhat poorly, but I think you know what I mean.
Now I see what you're getting at. That at least is a consistent statement. And certainly, if you're talking about an economy that's becoming less productive and poorer, then clearly you and I are entrepreneurs. Then we've got this massive market of people who don't have a whole lot of money, and how are we going to sell something to them? We'd like to there's a lot of them. We can make a fortune if we sell something to them that they want. And I guess that's why you were latching on McDonald's. And, indeed, obviously McDonald's meant a family of limited means could go out for dinner on a Sunday evening. And I think it was a good thing, and it was a reasonably nourishing meal and so on. And so I think it's good. But you're saying, well, okay, but I guess you're absolutely right. It's consistent with your assumption that if the central bank is going to make us poorer, I believe that my own framework is to say that a free market should be doubling in output every 10 years. It should be increasing 7% a year. We have so many things that hobble it, however, the central bank among them. I do think that people are going to become better off over the next 10 years. I do think that the basic movement toward freer markets that's occurred over the last 20, 30 years in China and elsewhere is going to continue. And we will see increased prosperity in most areas of the world. However, it will be far less than could be achieved if we had free markets. I think that my framework is to start with 7% growth a year, doubling every 10 years, and to work down from that, and to recognize that the central bank and other policies keep us at 2% a year, at 5 points of loss every year. So that's bad, but I do think of that as improvement. Even per capita improvement as well. And so I think that we will see better times over the next 10 years, although again, I do see the potential for a fiscal crisis 10 to 15 years out. So if your framework is increased poverty, then I see your argument. But if you accept my framework, which is increased prosperity, however, far, far less than could be achieved if we had a free market, and I blame, of course, the central bank for much of that below par performance, then I have a somewhat different perspective. Then people will be better off, and there will be a desire to sell them, more luxury goods. Although, of course, there will still be plenty of desire to sell them almost everything possible.
Yeah, fair enough. All right, Gene, I think we're getting to the end here. There's one thing I wanted to ask you, and then the floor is yours with what you want to go on with. But what do you see as the relationship between the CPI calculation and income tax brackets for individuals?
Well, that's right. That's another one that got indexed. I think it was in the early 80s, I think it was, where brackets got indexed to, I guess, a version of the CPI. Although, first of all, other forms of taxation are not indexed, like capital gains. But it definitely, by the way, it definitely hobbled government to some extent. I don't know the full politics of how that happened, that income tax was, but it was obviously pleasing to the voters. The point is that the indexing of brackets by the CPI. I guess actually it's interesting. The CPI overstating inflation, then then it does overstate the indexing. But the fact is that because of the money supply increase, nominal incomes rise even faster, and therefore the bracket indexing is only partially successful. You still suffer. Most of us who have rising incomes or have good years in terms of still suffer bracket creep anyway. And aside from that, of course, if you make money from other sources, then you pay higher inflation. So indeed, the indexing is partially helpful, but we still suffer some bracket creep. I don't know if that responds to the.
Well, I guess, and this whole conversation kind of was well, you've been making the case the entire time that the CPI is kind of net overstated, right?
And plus 1% a year.
Right. And so when I relate that to income tax brackets, presumably if the CPI was understated, that would be more detrimental because you'd eventually creep up into another category, but the real inflation would be less than what's being indexed. And as a result, maybe you creep up faster to another bracket than you otherwise should, right?
Well, I'm sorry, I didn't follow the last part.
So let me rephrase it. So if the CPI is 2%,
yeah,
but real inflation is 4%,
okay,
your bracket creep is going to be indexed to the 2%, and so you would be kind of penalized there because you may enter a higher bracket based on the CPI stated inflation versus the real inflation.
Yeah. Well, yes. Well, exactly. But what I'm saying is that even so, what happens is that nominal incomes rise faster, and that what you said is right as far as it went. But even though the CPI overstates inflation, and even though the brackets are indexed to the CPI, nominal incomes rise even faster. So while the indexing does limit the bracket creep, there is still bracket creep happening because the nominal incomes still rise. And so the brackets, you still rise in the bracket and then have to suffer because of progressive income tax rates. Of course, you suffer a higher income tax. So it's only partially helpful given the fact that nominal incomes are rising even faster, and therefore you pushed into a higher bracket. So that was my only technical point empirically. But you're right about that part of it in terms of your assumptions. But again, what I just want to emphasize broadly that, as I mentioned before, that when you talk about the motivations of government, there's a whole cross current of motivations, and certainly while the government while of course obviously you want as much taxes as you can possibly get, the indexing of the brackets, I guess, was a political maneuver that still holds, but I think that government still benefits from the fact that the brackets are that there is still bracket creep, and that there might be some greater push to modify the CPI. It doesn't seem as though it's very popular today. There was, as I say, in the mid-90s because of the fear about Social Security. But what's interesting and maybe a little bit tragic is that they're not trying to do that right now. And I guess, and that was the Clinton administration, interestingly, Democratic administration, that provoked a lot of howls that they were declaring war on Social Security by trying to modify the CPI, which to some extent they succeeded in doing. But so again, I'm only trying to say that, getting back to your broader question, that when we look at what the government does, probably would have place the greatest weight on bureaucratic inertia and on kicking the can down the road. Nobody cares that much. They aren't that demonic or monolithic in this regard. They still have a price index that overstates inflation.
Right. What else you got for me, Gene?
That's it, John. Well, I could go into some other things about some other items. I'm looking at the house prices and rents. If you really want to talk about crazy nightmare. What do you do with housing in the CPI? When 2/3 of households own their own, 64%, 65%, nearly 2/3 owns their own home, and about 1/3 rents. And how do you do that? But of course, that's just an interesting. That's not necessarily got to do with my hobby horse. They used to track mortgage interest rates that people paid. That was a crazy time. That they would look at a house, and then they would just look at the average cost of the mortgages, and that was the cost of housing, of living in a house that you owned. Rather crazy stuff. But I think that probably our listeners are rather exhausted. You and I have gotten some very good points across.
Yeah.
But again, I guess I want to emphasize that. Let me finish on a Murray Rothbard note. Murray Rothbard in Man, Economy, and State, a book that changed my life, my mind, great book. He inveighed against price indexes, and I just reread the passage, and he threw out examples which are a hat and other stuff. Actually, let me tell you another story. The consumer price index works on consumer surveys, and people have they know what they pay on food, but they don't know what they pay for umbrellas or how often they buy them. So that information is very scanty. Whereas the personal consumption expenditure deflator works with actual store purchases, and so they have much better weights because the store purchase is a much better example about how frequently people buy umbrellas and other chancy items. But Rothbard tried to dump completely on the idea of price indexes by throwing out the price of a hat, the price of an umbrella, stuff that people don't even buy that often, rather than talking about the staples that people buy all the time. And then he said, "Oh, this is how can you do this? It's how can you weight them? How do we even know what's going on?" And so it was kind of the worst moment for Rothbard because he wasn't even choosing a very realistic example, even though he was a great economist. But then I do find that if you listen to some of Rothbard's lectures on economic history, he deals with nominal numbers, and the next thing you know, he's using a price index to deflate them, and in order to make them realistic. So that was the great Murray Rothbard's hypocritical moment. Right. So again, I want to say to my Austrian friends that price indexes are an art and not a science. They're only an approximation. Everything I've said is even, there are different ways of looking at it. Two smart people could divide price indexes that would be a little bit different. What do you do with housing when people own their own homes? All kinds of problems that arise. But there are methods that have been developed that are pretty smart, that does understate inflation, but it's still valid to recognize that almost everything John Vallis said in the last 2.5 hours is nonetheless true.
Wow.
Yeah.
Gene,
yeah.
I'm not used to this level of, this praise. I'm not used to this at all.
Well, okay. Yeah, John, I knew I'd floor you with that.
All right. Well, let me hit you with a question that
for the most part didn't disagree with me about the CPI, John. So I don't know
Well, you're the expert on the CPI. That's why I got you here.
Yeah, fair enough, John. But you could say I don't buy it. You goddamn expert. This doesn't sound. I thought you.
Well, let me condense all that argument into the cherry on the top here.
Yeah.
So we have price inflation represented in the CPI.
Yeah.
We have monetary inflation that we can look at the monetary base, the increase in the money supply to get an idea of. We're in a for sound money advocates, for the Bitcoiners who look at these metrics to determine or to get a sense for the importance of sound money in society at, potentially, for the importance of sound money in society. What should we be looking at what metric, what kind of synthesis of those two things should we be looking at to determine the importance of sound money in a society?
Well, I guess it gets back to my point that, if I follow you correctly, that if Bitcoiners who believe in a flat, stable money supply, neither increasing or decreasing, neither inflation of money supply or deflation, then bottom line, we really would be looking at a 5% decline in prices every year, approximately. And so that's our baseline. And that the inflation really is the difference between that 5% decline and what would be legitimately recorded. I think it's not been 2%. It's been about 1.5%, a little over 1% inflation. So we should recognize that inflation has been happening, and it's not been 1%. It's been, according to my arithmetic, 6%. We should recognize that, and we should recognize that it's not the sort of thing we want, especially for the lower half of the population. And then we should also, I think, recognize that the free market has been behaving better. We have more of a free market, I think, than maybe you would acknowledge. We've had some good developments over the last 20, 25 years of discounting, global competition, employment of cheap labor that's been causing that 5% decline. And recognize then that if we apply a proper price index, we have seen a reasonable amount of economic progress on all levels. We haven't had the centralized economy. I guess maybe this is where the cutting edge lies with my Austrian friends. The centralized crony capitalist economy is still a huge drag. It still meant that we could have 7% growth, and instead we've had 2% growth, and that has made an extraordinary difference. But we still have had growth. We still have had prosperity, and so we might want to hold on to those facts.
Noted. Let me revise my initial question. But all that is, thank you for explaining that. But let me revise this. A lot of us think, whether, perhaps erroneously so, but a lot of us think that the level of intervention by central banks, by the Fed, by governments around the world today will inevitably lead to hyperinflation. That's certainly a possible outcome. Yeah. So what I guess the whole point of this discussion, and I'll just get you to confirm this, is you believe that the CPI is a reliable metric for us to be looking at to assess the level of inflation in an economy. So basically what you've said is that we get, about minus 5% deflation as a result of technological advancements. And then we're brought up to, in your opinion, 1% via, central government, central bank intervention. If we define hyperinflation as, 10, 20, 30, 100% inflation, you think that will be represented in the CPI, and we can track the CPI and continue to keep an eye on the CPI to get a sense for what inflation is really doing?
Well, I would say, by the way, just a small point, I would say it's not a huge stretch to look at the personal consumption expenditures deflator, the PCE, which is more accurate. I think the PCE it overstates inflation by about 4/10. The PCE, personal consumption expenditures deflator, used by the Bureau of Economic Analysis to deflate consumer spending. They don't use the CPI. They use the PCE. The PCE uses inputs from the CPI, but it does the full substitution that I mentioned. But it runs into problems with technology. But then, getting back to your question, in the 1970s and early 80s, when we did have double-digit inflation, I know that because both the PCE and the CPI were showing it. The PCE, if we have a return to double-digit inflation, the PCE, personal consumption expenditures deflator, PCE, will be shown. And that, by the way, is what the Federal Reserve mentions a good part of the time. That's their preferred measure. So you might as well look at it anyway. It is available on, just look, it's posted on the Bureau of Economic Analysis website. Write me anytime, John, I can update you on it. I get Haver data, simple enough. And I guess not carried in the press that much. Maybe they report on the CPI more. But the PCE is around. It's available in the age of the internet. But getting back to your question, I again stress that my easy scenario, easy in the sense that it's an easy forecast, is that there's a combination of factors that I believe are going to start pushing us toward double-digit inflation, which I went over before, having to do with the busting of the budget, the 10, 12 years out. And that, of course, is very much a central bank created phenomenon because there's so much debt being bought by the central bank, and then that could be, and that indeed is a federal government central bank collusion that is expanding the size of government, and that because the central bank will then be called into trying to bail out the federal government, that will sow the seeds for a double-digit inflation, and that will of course, also be a part and parcel of the other factors that I mentioned being played out, the cheap labor from global competition, cheap labor in China, from other areas, mostly being tapped out. And then on top of that, we will get back to a point where we'll have a reasonably tight labor market. So I think that within 10, 15 years, we are going to see what you mentioned, double-digit inflation, measured by the PCE or CPI. It was measured in the 1970s. And then we had an interesting history there. We did indeed have a major recession that broke the back of the inflation. Exactly how it will play out differently, but I do see an opportunity for Bitcoin. So indeed, I'm saying that others might be correct in saying that it's going to happen sooner rather than later. I'm just saying that the forces that will lead us in that direction are almost inevitable toward double-digit inflation that I mentioned, having to do with the way in which the deficit and the budget of the federal government are rising. So indeed, you and I are on the same page. Maybe we have a different scenario, but the causes and the underlying factors are there. I dread it. I'm not looking forward to it. And the only silver lining that I like to latch upon is that it could be an opportunity for Bitcoin to become the money of choice.
And let me ask you this question, which I asked your friend Lawrence White, and of course you're free not to answer for privacy reasons, but for
no secrets from you, John. Yeah.
Well, well, seeing seeing things the way that you do, as you just articulated, and seeing the door open ajar for something like Bitcoin, do you have a position in Bitcoin?
I should. I'm embarrassed to say I did own some Bitcoin. I'm going to get around to it. I want to go with my. I've just been busy and.
Gene.
Okay, no, look, this is my shame. You've thoroughly embarrassed me in front of your million listeners, John. But no, indeed, as I say, not as I do. The point, the basic idea, I think, for conservative people like me. Look, I am 75, John. That's my excuse. Although I do expect to live till 100, and so I'm obviously going to be seeing that along with you, and so I should be owning some Bitcoin. But it's, I wanted to do it through my broker, and then I found I'm a Morgan Stanley broker, and I found they don't do Bitcoin, so I've got to get instruction in doing. What I want to do is do an income averaging with Bitcoin. What I would suggest any conservative person do. Allocate a certain amount of money in proportion to your income and in proportion to your broad savings, not all of it. Own stocks and bonds, just as I do, but do a monthly purchase of Bitcoin, which would be just sort of income averaging, whatever it's a certain, like $200 worth of Bitcoin bought every month. Right. Or $500 that you buy every month. I've been planning to do that, John. But
dollar cost averaging is definitely the way to go in a market with this type of volatility and everything.
Yeah. Well, I guess.
But I can send you some resources to make it easier on you, Gene. There's lots of good companies out there now that I'm sure would be more than happy to help, especially if they know old Gene Epstein is looking to get involved. So I'd be happy to do that. Gene, before we sign off, well, first of all, thank you again for taking so much time to have this discussion with me and enlighten me with your knowledge of the CPI, inflation, and related issues. Any places you want to direct people listening? Any of the stuff that you're doing these days? Anything like that?
Well, I'm planning to come out. Well, I'm planning to come out with a discussion of the issue of herd immunity with respect to the COVID-19 crisis. I do believe that the numbers are more and more indicating that we've achieved herd immunity in the New York area, and that we can reopen the bars, the restaurants, the Broadway shows. And I want to explain that I find that herd immunity is just barely discussed, and to some degree not even very well understood. And I found that epidemiology is not such a difficult field. You just have to know your numbers. And I've been talking closely with a very skilled and very knowledgeable epidemiologist and learning about how the numbers work. I don't think we have herd immunity in Texas, but we may be getting there. But certainly there's good. All the numbers indicate that it looks like we've achieved it in New York, and for reasons that are fairly clear. We did have a lot of people afflicted. And then also, by the way, we've achieved herd immunity partly because of cross immunity, which is minimized. The understanding that the research showing that a lot of previous coronavirus flus and other flus have achieved some immunity that's cross immunity, that made a number of people immune to the new COVID-19 virus. That aside, I also want to get people interested in the Soho Forum. Our debate on racism has been reissued. Just go into thesohoforum.org to hear our debate on racism. In a month, we're going to have a debate on the presidential election. And I hope, of course, that we can return to our physical space, the Subculture Theater. We will continue to have our debates. And John, you should come visit us in New York on this. I'd like to get to know you personally, and you're a pleasure to talk to. And we should spend some time together. So please come to the Soho Forum. You should probably take a vacation in New York, John.
Well, Gene, once things open up again, it's definitely at the very top of my list, and I'd love to come down, speak with you, have a bite to eat, and enjoy some of the events and debates at the Soho Forum. That would be awesome.
Be a pleasure, John.
All right.
And talk to you soon.
All right, Gene.